Anglahi Exploits from Pain to Pearl event. Hello, everybody. Nice to see your faces. Hello po. I am Kathy.
And I am Derek.
And we will be your hosts for today. So we're very excited that you all can join us here. And some of you might be wondering, what does Anglahi mean? So Anglahi is actually a combination of two Tagalog words. So angat meaning uplift and lahi meaning race.
And we believe that we want to uplift our race through 4 eyes. And those 4 eyes are identity, image, influence, and inspiration. See, we believe that if we grow deeper in our identity as Filipinos, when we come to know our identity, we will be able to uplift or change the way that we represent ourselves, our image as Filipinos. And once we know that, once we get those two, we want to be able to influence other Filipinos around us. But it doesn't stop there. We also want to be able to inspire other races to follow those 4 eyes and also do the same.
So for over a decade now, Anglahi has been involved in so many things. We've been raising awareness about our Filipino culture and at the same time serving our community through many shows, concerts, and a variety of classes.
And now, for the first time ever, in light of the circumstances, we have a pandemic, we have to go virtual. We are doing our very first Anglahi Exploits webinar. So again, can we all have a big round of applause for that? Right? Yeah, we can hear you. I know you're unmuted. We know you're muted, but we can hear the claps. We can hear it.
Yeah, we can hear you for sure.
So, actually, 2 years ago, we started a project called 12 Million in 2018, and the goal was twofold. We wanted to make sure that we got the stories of the Filipino diaspora out there on the forefront for the people who don't know them. But we also wanted to raise funds for this very recreational space that we are using right now to do this webinar. And we wanted to get you updated, and we wanted you to see what happened last year. So at this moment, let's just take a look at this recap video of 12 million from last year.
pamilya o pamilyar. Pasakit, hirap, kalungkutan, dinaanan. Para sa pamilya itatawid at mabigyang magandang kinabukasan. Hindi biro, sadyang mapusok. Buhay, iba't ibang lahi kasalamuha mo. Dugo at pawis, hindi sapat. Aking natutunan, magdasal, mangarap, sumunod sa bulong na buong may kapal.
Growing up, never knew my identity. Got distracted by the culture that's in front of me. I dig deep for the roots of another tree. Till I found the truth I call my own. We may be coming from many different circumstances, but each day let us rise up and take a chance. Till the day 12 million stand as one. Spread out when we under the same sun. Give it back to the land from which you came. Keep it going and we'll never be the same. Give it back to the land from which you came. Keep it going and we'll never be the same.
Ang lahi sa buhay mo. Tayo'y maging ilaw at asin sa mundo at itim. Huwag kang magpapatalo. Walang atras, ikaw ay ligtas. Sa akin ay kumapit, huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw. Tatlong bituin, isang araw.
Give it back to the land from which you came. Keep it going and we'll never be the same. Keep it going and we'll never be the same. Keep it going and we'll never be the same.
Huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw.
So this year, our theme is From Pain to Pearl. We have a lot of things that are very special for you today, and one of those things is we're actually going to go back and revisit our Filipino-American history and hopefully look at it through a new set of eyes. And at the same time today, you'll be hearing stories of our fearless frontliners. So what's great about our theme is that we can see that as we study our pains from the past and even the present, we can turn them into something beautiful.
So, Kathy, I just wanted to ask you a question. How do you react? What is your knee-jerk reaction when you go through pain or when you get hurt?
I get sad and cry.
Not surprised for those that do know her, right? Not surprising. For those that are in the Zoom right now, we want you to answer that question. So quickly on the chat box below, what is your knee-jerk or gut reaction when you go through pain or when you get hurt? Don't think about it too much. You don't have to be philosophical. Just really quickly, what is your knee-jerk reaction? Type it down in the chat box below.
We'd love to see
We'd
your
love for you to
answers.
participate. Pray. Yes.
Ooh,
Amen.
That's a good one.
Eat. Oh, yes. Eat or go for a walk. Cry with
I
capital
also-
letters.
Nice, Jillian. I see you.
Jillian, yes. Also cry. Keep it coming, po. Keep it coming. Doesn't have to be a long breakdown. Yes. Me too. I react like Kathy.
A lot of
It's-
people like me.
It seems like everyone cries like Kathy. Yes. Okay. Eat. Specifically, what do you eat? Ice cream, maybe. Dessert, maybe. So yes, punch the pillow. That is an only child thing. That is an only child thing. I relate to that. I relate to that. All right, thank you for those responses. Again, we'll keep them coming. But usually when we go through pain, we usually like to avoid it. That's why instead of taking out the pain, we get that pain as only children and we start punching our own pillows, right? Peace, that's what you put. So usually when we go through pain, we usually like to avoid it or we like to go around it. But sometimes the best thing to do is actually to go through our pain, because when we go through our pain, we actually grow from it. We become better from it. And one of the best illustrations that we have is actually in Mother Nature, which is the development of a pearl. See, when a pearl is made, it's actually a very, very painful process. But at the end of the day, it becomes something so beautiful. So our team made a beautiful illustration here, and we want to show you this video of our theme of pain to pearl. So let's watch this.
Pearls are one of the most precious and sought-after jewels in the world. However, have you ever wondered how pearls, these round, precious beads of considerable value, are actually made? Allow us to take you on a journey. The creation of a pearl is one of nature's most beautiful and mysterious secrets. The process begins when an irritant, like a grain of sand or parasite for example, invades the shell of an oyster and latches itself onto the soft tissue. That irritant aggravates the oyster, very much like a splinter would on your skin. But unlike our usual reaction to remove splinters, the oyster responds by allowing the irritant to linger inside. The oyster's inner shell is made of nacre, a rich iridescent material that protects oysters from the harsh environments they live in. In response to the disruption, the oyster begins to cover the irritant with nacre. The oyster doesn't shy away from its pain. Instead, the oyster responds by bringing out what it's made of to accept the pain, using it to enrich its own value. Thousands of layers and several years worth of nacre later, what was once an aggravation and intrusion is now a lustrous, precious pearl. What was once a source of pain to the oyster is now a pearl of the oyster, an object of great value and worth sought out by many people throughout the world. What if I told you that instead you have something of value, that you have a pearl of your own, a beautiful one, born out of pain, that you can offer to the world? What if you are the oyster, and your pearl, your life story? Would you see your pain differently? Perhaps it's not an accident that the Philippines is known as the Pearl of the Orient. We Filipinos are a people of pain, yes. We have the power to transform our pain into something valuable, beautiful. From our pain can come forth pearls.
And now we would like to move forward and introduce our senior advisor, Gina Atencio, as she speaks about Filipino-American history revisited.
Gandang hapon po, good afternoon. And if you're not from America, if you're from Europe, I see a lot of people from Europe, and I'm so happy that you have joined us. I see Coach Kev, and I presume, though you're not in the screen, I presume one of your life coaches, Coach Boyet, is also with us today. Thank you so much for joining us today, because the topic for today I think is very important, because this is one portion of our history that is kind of erased, obliterated from our history books. Some perhaps of the things that I'm going to talk about we have not heard yet, though we took up Philippine history when we were students in perhaps grade school, high school, and even in college. So today I bring to us the lessons of pain to pearl, because there is so much pain that we have experienced in our history. I might sound a little bit anti-American because our coverage today is about the Philippine-American history, and the Philippine-American history does not start when the Alaskeros landed in Alaska, or the Manila men landed in Louisiana, or when the Sakadas landed in Hawaii. Our relationship with America goes way, way back, sometime around 1800s, when we were included in what you call the Spanish-American War, the first battle of which was the Battle of Manila Bay. Ito mga ikikwento ko, these are things that perhaps we have not heard. What we know in history most of the time is that we were colonized by the Americans in 1898. But what transpired, how that came about, we kinda are a little bit vague of what really happened when there was a transfer of people ruling over us from the Spaniards to the Americans. We're kind of vague also of what our history really is from the time of 1898 to 1945, when World War II ended and we were released by the Americans, and we became one nation. Today, we will be covering that part of our history. And as we take that up, maybe I might sound a little bit anti-American, but the truth is, it is only because we are covering this segment of our history because of the topic revisiting Philippine-American history. The truth is, we have also experienced pain, much pain, when we were under the Spaniards. I see people from Barcelona. Hopefully one day we can be able to talk about that. We also experienced pain when we were under the Japanese, especially during that infamous Bataan March. But for today, we will be talking about this pain, this side of pain of our history. That's the reason why I'm so happy that we are using this year, 2020, Anglahi Exploit in celebration of the Filipino-American Month here in America to discuss the journey of the Filipinos from pain to pearl. As that video showed a while ago, it is not but by an accident that we are called the Pearl of the Orient. And the pearl is developed when we respond properly to pain. When we embrace pain, we are able to experience the pleasure of a journey. Pain is a very good motivation for us to continue on with strength. I remember a quote, and I'd like to start with that. It is by Khalil Gibran. He said this, listen to this: out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. That's why pain is a gift. Pain to pearl shows us that to be able to handle the irritants of our lives as it penetrates our shell and irritates us, we are able to develop a knacker to protect us from these irritants. And after many years, build what we call the precious pearl. Khalil Gibran, out of suffering have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars. Are seared with scars. That's the reason why Benjamin Disraeli said, there is no education like the adversity of pain. There is no education like the adversity of pain. So we begin today our teaching on Philippine-American relationship or history revisited by talking about the Spanish-American War. Because the first encounter of the Filipinos with the Americans was in a battle called the Battle of Manila Bay. It was part of the Spanish-American War. You see, the 1800s was what we call the age of imperialism. It was in the late 1800s, around 1890s, that America joined the other countries of Europe in colonizing other countries. Prior to that, they believed that they should keep other countries from a distance and just be concerned about their own development as a nation. Ang tawag nila doon, Washington isolationism. Keep the other countries far away from us. Let us just be involved with our own affairs so that we can develop strength and fortitude as a nation. But in 1898, America became a part of what you call the modern imperial age. Imperialism involves what we call the process of colonizing. At pag sinabi mong nag-colonize ka, when you colonize, that means you will invade, influence, annex, and govern other parts of the world. And during the age of imperialism, it's the European countries that were annexing, colonizing, invading, governing other parts of the world, particularly Asia and Africa. But in 1898, America joined this age of imperialism, joined Europe nations, and became an imperialist as well. This is the untold part of our history, especially yung tinatawag nating Filipino-American War, Part 1, and Filipino-American War, Part 2, or that which is called the Bangsamoro War. Let's talk about the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War was the result of America's intervention on the ongoing Cuban War of Independence with Spain. Spain was in Cuba, and Cuba, if you look at the map, is around 90 miles from the shore of Florida. The Spaniards were violating the Monroe Doctrine concept that say, I don't want to talk about that now. All I can say is that Spain was in America's back door. And because they were violating the Monroe Doctrine concept, Spain, you should not be there. You can't be there because that's ours. Monroe Doctrine, maybe just to say this, is an upgrade of what we call Washington isolationism. During the time of Washington, America was saying, let us not meddle with the affairs of other countries. Let's keep the other countries far away from us. Let's be independent of them so that we can build ourselves. Monroe Doctrine is an upgrade of Washington isolationism. It is saying, let us not only be independent of others and and have nothing to do with others. Monroe Doctrine is saying, let also the others have nothing to do with us. They should leave us alone. But you see, Spain was in violation of that Monroe Doctrine because he was in Americas. Though America cannot occupy Southern America, Latin America, they kind of felt, Spain, you have nothing to do with this territory. That's Monroe Doctrine. They were in violation of that. And thus, the Spanish War occurred because of the atrocities being committed against the Cubans who were fighting for their independence. They were fighting for independence. The Spanish-American War marked Americans' entry into the world affairs. Since then, the United States has had a significant hand in various conflicts around the world and has entered into many treaties and agreements. Before the Spanish War po, the United States was characterized by this isolationism, an approach to foreign policy that asserts that a nation's interests are best served by keeping the affairs of other countries at a distance. But after this po, they got involved so much with the affairs of the others that they became a part of signing a lot of treaties and agreements with other countries. This was the beginning of their having a significant hand in various conflicts around the world. The Spanish-American War also ended the Spanish Empire. Yun ho ang tumapos sa Spanish Empire. During the time, Spain was a huge empire. But the one that ended their becoming an empire was the Spanish-American War. But the Spanish-American War also ushered America as a world power because of the Paris Treaty or the Treaty of Paris. Yung mga French, nangyari yan sa inyo. Because after the Treaty of Paris, America was granted temporary control of Cuba, indefinite colonial authority over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. That's a summary po of this Spanish-American War. It only had 3 battles. The Battle of Manila Bay, Philippines in May 1, 1898. The Battle of San Juan Hill, Cuba, July 1, 1898. And the Battle of Santiago, Cuba, July 3, 1898. Pero tingnan niyo po mabuti itong 3 battles na ito. If the issue was about Cuba, how come the first battle, after 10 days of America declaring war with Spain because of the atrocities committed with the natives of Cuba, if it was all about Cuba, how come the first battle of the Spanish-American War was not in Cuba? It was in Manila Bay. April 21, 1898, America declared war against Spain. But just after 10 days, Commodore George Dewey, who was in Hong Kong, steamed his fleet to the Philippines, attacked the entire Spanish Armada, which was at anchor at Manila Bay, and destroyed the Spanish Armada without losing an American life. Wala akong nabatay. In fact, 7 hours lang yung war. It was just 7 hours. From the attack, the Spanish fleet, except for a single ship called the Castilla, has been sunk. But the battle was one of the most decisive Navy battles in history because that ended Spanish Empire and the colonial period of the Philippine history. I'd like you to watch this video. Was it all about Cuba? To just make us understand, was there something more? Was it just really about getting Spain out of Cuba and declaring independence, helping Cuba gain their independence from this nation? Let's watch, was it all about Cuba?
A more important battle was that of Manila Bay, in which Commodore George Dewey destroyed a tiny Spanish fleet and took the Philippines. This battle took place in May of 1898, well before the attack on Cuba, which strongly suggests that a war that was supposedly about supporting Cuban independence was really about something else. And what was that something else? Oh, right, a territorial empire. As a result of the war, the U.S. got a bunch of new territories, notably the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. We also used the war as an opportunity to annex Hawaii to protect our ships that would be steaming toward the Philippines. American presence in China was bolstered by our contribution of about 3,000 troops to the multinational force that helped put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. But in the Philippines, where Americans had initially been welcome, opinions soon changed after it became clear that Americans were there to stay and exercise control. Emiliano Aguinaldo, leader of the Filipino rebellion against Spain, quickly turned against the U.S. because his real goal was independence, and it appeared the U.S. would not provide it. The resulting Philippine War lasted 4 years, from 1899 to 1903, and 4,200 Americans were killed, as well as over 100,000 Filipinos. The Americans committed atrocities, including putting Filipinos in concentration camps, torturing prisoners, rape, and executing civilians. And much of this was racially motivated, and news of these atrocities helped to spur anti-imperialist sentiment at home, with Mark Twain being one of the most outspoken critics. Now, there was some investment in modernization in the Philippines, in railroads, schools, and public health, but the interests of the local people were usually subordinated to those of the wealthy. So American imperialism, in short, looked like most other imperialism. Now let's briefly talk about anti-imperialism. There were lots of people who objected to imperialism on racial grounds, arguing that it might lead to, like, diversity. But there were also non-racist anti-imperialists who argued that empire itself, with its political domination of conquered people, was incompatible with democracy, which, to be fair, it is. The Democratic Party, which had supported intervention in Cuba in 1900, opposed the Philippine War in its platform. Some progressives opposed imperialism too, because they believed that America should focus on its domestic problems. Yet those who supported imperialism were just as forceful. Among the most vocal was Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge, who argued that imperialism was benevolent and would bring a new day of freedom. But make no mistake, underneath it all, imperialism was all about trade. According to Beveridge, America's commerce must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. In the end, imperialism was really driven by economic necessity. In 1902, Brooks Adams predicted in his book, The New Empire, that the U.S. would soon, quote, outweigh any single empire, if not all empires combined. Within 20 years, America would be the world's leading economic power. We didn't have the most overseas territory, but ultimately, that didn't matter. Now, the reasons for imperialism, above all the quest for markets for American goods, would persist long after imperialism became recognized as antithetical to freedom and democracy. And we would continue to struggle to reconcile our imperialistic urges with our ideals about democracy until now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
McKinley did not want war.
The idea of Cuban independence had taken hold.
On the other hand, he wanted things that only war could give him.
The Spanish were not going to get out, and they were not on the run.
He wanted a peaceful Cuba. He wanted U.S. control of the Caribbean. He wanted a naval base in the Spanish colony of the Philippines.
McKinley called for volunteers. Then I got my gun. First Spaniard I saw coming, I shot him on the run. It was all about that battleship of Maine.
I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one.
Assistant Secretary of the Navy Roosevelt thought that a war with Spain over Cuba would make us a world power.
At war with that great nation Spain. When I get through with Spain, I will have honored my name. It was all about that battleship of Maine.
The Americans always felt that deep in his heart, the Cuban wanted to be a part of the United States.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their liberators, but when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos became suspicious of American motives.
It was all about that battleship of Maine.
1890s America. The nation headed full speed into a new industrial age. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, millions gathered to celebrate the innovations that powered American productivity. Incandescent lights, efficient farming methods, modern railways, a faster printing press. Visitors could even taste the promise of the next century. Cracker Jacks, diet soda, and the hamburger made their American debut.
I cherish the thought that America stands on the threshold of a great awakening. The impulse with which this phantom city could rise in our midst is proof that the Spirit is with us. President Grover Cleveland, opening day, May 1st, 1893.
When Commodore, later Admiral George Dewey's flagship, together with its fleet, steamed against the Spanish Armada fleet. It was with the intention of entering Manila and eventually colonizing the Philippines. It was led by a battleship called Olympic Battleship. That was the flagship of Commodore George Dewey. It was launched in 1892. Olympic is now the oldest steel warship afloat in the world, one of only 2 ships left from World War I, the other being the Battleship of Texas. I got a chance to go to the flagship Olympic Museum in Philadelphia, and inside that ship, it has become a museum since 1950s. Inside that ship, there was this portion which was designated to cover yung ating Battle of Manila Bay. There at the top deck of the flagship Olympic Museum in Philadelphia was the date May 1, 1898, the day that the Battle of Manila Bay began. When you enter, you see a greeting that says, "Welcome aboard." And at the lower portion of that greeting, it says this: "Today, Olympia is both celebrated and condemned for launching America into the world political stage as Admiral George Dewey's flagship in the Battle of Manila Bay. It is both celebrated and condemned." Philippines during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Olympia is also remembered ceremoniously transporting World War I body of the unknown soldiers across the Atlantic to be enshrined in Arlington National Cemetery in 1921. Sabi ho dito, we are proud of her. It is celebrated, but we should not erase the fact of what it's all about. Because there in that ship was Emilio Aguinaldo that was taken from Hong Kong, who was during at the time was exiled. There was the pack of Biak na Bato. It was a pack of Emilio Aguinaldo with the Governor General of the Philippines then from Spain. And in that pack, he was allowed to be exiled together with the other insurgents, and they were given amnesty and financial support. the financial support, Aguinaldo and the insurgents who were in Hong Kong exiled were thinking they were going to use that to buy ammunition so that they can continue their insurgency once there is a path for them to there's a path allowed for them to return back to the Philippines. Well, the path was opened by the Americans. When the Americans went to Dewey, they also made a stop at the place of Aguinaldo. They took Aguinaldo and asked Aguinaldo to lead again the insurgents in a fight against the Spaniards. Many of you know Union Square. Ilan po ba sa inyo ang tiga San Francisco? Patingin ng kamay. Mga tiga Sanfo. Yan, okay. Alam nyo ba yung Union Square? Yan. Napupuntahan nyo po ba yon? If you notice, merong pong monument doon. Ang tawag po sa monument noon ay Admiral Dewey Monument. We have a lot of Filipino-American events there. In fact, I kind of suspect there is something going on there now. But you see, that is a monument that is actually commemorating the Battle of Manila Bay. San Francisco kasi was a major naval port and point of departure for American soldiers on their way to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. In honor of these men, the city decided to redesign the center of Union Square and build a monument to commemorate Admiral Dewey's victory over the Spanish fleet at Manila during that war. By the way, the Spanish-American War was called by John Hay. How many of you go to Camp John Hay, Baguio? Could I see your hands? Okay. John Hay was the U.S. Secretary of State during the time that we were under the Americans. And U.S. Secretary of State John Hay called the Spanish-American War a splendid little war. Pakitingnan nyo nga yung tao sa tabi mo. Pakisabi mo nga sa kanya, it was a splendid little war. Why? Because that war lasted only for 2.5 months. Around 10 weeks lang yan. In fact, Manila Bay, Battle of Manila Bay, happened in 7 hours. And the next 2 battles happened in 6 weeks. It was very short because the Spanish garrison was reeling already from nationwide insurgent attacks. Yung dalawang battles po sa Cuba, they were already reeling from nationwide insurgent attacks by the natives, and they were wasted heavily by the yellow fever. All, in the Spanish-American War, there were 4,000 Americans who died. But guess what? Only 300 to 400 Americans died because of the battle. 90% of the deaths were caused by a disease called yellow fever. That's why John Hay called it a splendid little war. Why? They just had a small amount of casualties, very minimal effort, but that ended the Spanish Empire, ushered in America as a world power, and eventually America gained Philippines together with Puerto Rico, Cuba, sa atin, Cubao yan, Cuba, and Hawaii. Because of, thanks to you, Paris, the Treaty of Paris. American imperialism. I'd like to show us that the American imperialism that happened had polarized America like crazy. It polarized America like crazy. Stanley Carnot in the book, In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines said this. Listen to this. The dream of empire gradually germinated in the minds of the Americans. Strategists warned that another foreign power, most likely Japan or Germany, would grab the Philippine Islands if the United States withdrew. And that was a strong sentiment by the expansionists. They were called the imperialists, the nationalists, the expansionists. There was one comic strip because during the time we were always in the news here in America. One is this. We see McKinley stepping on a Philippine native that's lying on an island labeled Philippines. And underneath are those words, is he to be a despot? Because overlooking are the leaders, the giant leaders of European countries. Imperialism versus anti-imperialism. The acquisition of the Philippine archipelago appalled New York and Boston patricians because they understood what it was to somehow be victimized by a monarchy, the monarchy of England. So they were the acquisition of the Philippine archipelago appalled New York and Boston patricians, many of them old abolitionists who equated the subjugation of people overseas with slavery. In fact, nagkaroon po ng tinatawag na AIL, which is the Anti-Imperialist League. That was the first peace movement in the United States of America. Its members were opposed to the idea of the U.S. becoming an imperialist power like the European countries. It was organized right after Admiral Dewey sank the Spanish ships on June 18, 1898. Let's show one cartoon. Anti-imperialist cartoon against the takeover of the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. Because the argument of AIL to be an imperialist is to abandon our most important American political belief and ideals of self-government and non-intervention. That was expressed in the United States Declaration of Independence, in George Washington's farewell address, and Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. In short, it breached the constitutional principle of government by consent of the governed. This is one dahilan why we have elections. We can choose representatives whom we can trust will decide on policies and laws that will always consider our own interests. To be an imperialist or to become a country that colonizes other countries is somehow to breach this constitutional principle of government by consent by the governed. Some of the people po of the AIL were the likes of Andrew Carnegie, because America bought the Philippines for $20 million. This is stated now, it is brought out now into the open, something we did not know in our history books when we were still studying back home in the Philippines, Philippine history. Andrew Carnegie offered to pay back US with $20 million. The other one that was an anti-imperialist was Mark Twain. We know him for his books, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. That is his pen name. In one quote, I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. One time he said this, I have read carefully the Treaty of Paris. I have seen that we do not intend to free, but to subjugate the people of the Philippines. We have gone there to conquer, not to redeem. It should, it seems to me, be our pleasure and duty to make those people free and let them deal with their own domestic questions in their own way. In fact, philosopher and psychologist William James, another anti-imperialist, have strong words for United States. He said, God damn the U.S. for its vile conduct in the Philippine Isles. That was one group in America called AIL, or the Anti-Imperialist League. At the other side were what you call the imperialists or the expansionists or the nationalists. They were called the Jingos. They believed that to enter into imperialism was to expand national territory and economic influence. One of them was Theodore Roosevelt, who became popular after he came back to America from the battles in Cuba. He campaigned to run for governor in New York. In October 1898, his campaign gathered momentum and he pleaded in one of his more memorable speeches for retaining the Philippines. Ito hong sinabi niya, "The guns of our warships have awakened us to new duties. We are face to face with our destiny, and we must meet it with a high and resolute courage. Let us rather run the risk of wearing out than rusting out. Nations that expand and nations that do not expand may both ultimately go down, but the one leaves heirs and a glorious memory, and the other, wala, leaves neither. The Roman expanded and has left a memory which has profoundly influenced the history of mankind. Similarly today, it is the great expanding people which will bequeath to future ages the great memories and material results of their achievements, and the nations which shall have sprung from their loins, England standing as the archetype and the best exemplar of all such mighty nations." Kailangan natin gayahin ang England. Tingnan mo sila, they are in their glorious state. But the people that do not expand leave and can leave nothing behind them. In fact, Theodore Roosevelt called the anti-imperialists the men of bygone age. And that was apt, because many of these people of the anti-imperialist league were in their 60s or 70s, yearned to keep America unfettered by foreign entanglements. By contrast, yung mga imperialists po, they were militant imperialists. Like Roosevelt, Lodge, and Beveridge were young, dynamic, progressive, infused with idealism. Pagpapatuloy ko po, I hope you're still with me. Henry Watterson of Louisville Courier-Journal, "To surrender territory acquired by the outlay of so much blood and treasure would be a wanton and cowardly abandonment of obligations and opportunities literally heaven sent, for they were not originally contemplated by anybody. The traditional stay-at-home and mind-your-own business policies laid down by George Washington was wise for a weak and struggling nation. But each of the century has its own tale or progress to tell. We must adapt ourselves to the changed order. We must make a new map. The United States from now on is destined to be a world power. Henceforth, its foreign policy will need to be reconstructed." And thus, from being an isolationist, America started to meddle with the foreign affairs of other countries. There are reasons why they wanted the Philippines, why the first battle of the Spanish-American War was the Battle of Manila Bay. Why there is what you call the Battle of Manila, eventually, after the Battle of Manila Bay, and the two other battles of the Spanish-American War, which was a splendid little war. There are two reasons. One, the Philippines can house the two most important U.S. military bases overseas. You see, America has to position itself as a global military power for national defense and economic security. And U.S. naval strategist Alfred Mahan said, "National power depends on control of the world's sea lanes." U.S. naval strategist Alfred Mahan also said, "Whoever rules the waves rules the world." And that's why take over territories, that's the Philippines, especially the ones that can be used as fueling stations for our ships. And thus, in 1903, Clark Air Base, Pampanga, the two most important U.S. military bases overseas, one was Clark Air Base, Pampanga. Immediately after acquiring Philippines for $20 million, 1903, Clark Air Base a 3,420 hectares of land in Pampanga was taken. After that, the Subic Naval Base in Olongapo. Nauna pala Subic Naval Base, Olongapo, 1901. Also became a military reservation for the U.S. Navy. That's the reason why there was this strong interest for the Philippines. But the second is also this. Philippines is a stepping stone to China. It is for global economic power. There's cheap labor, like the nurses that we see now here in America, and there was supply of raw material. By the late 1800s, American farmers were overproducing. There was a surplus, overproduction of steel and other raw materials in merchandising products. So the need to expand their market globally to increase sales of products had to be done. Number two, it was not only global market, it was also cheap labor. They had to increase the workforce. But there's also a steady supply of raw material, like oil, rubber, manganese for steel, required that the industrial nations maintain firm control over those unexplored areas. China was a huge potential for national sources and U.S. market. Tingnan po itong isang picture po that was presented in one of their newspapers. After all, the Philippines are only the stepping stone to China. Again, Senator Albert Beveridge of Indiana. Americans' commerce must be with Asia. The Pacific is our ocean. Where shall we turn for consumers of our surplus? Geography answers the question. China is our natural customer. These were the reasons why they wanted to get in to the Philippines. Pag tinignan niyo po yung map, ano po, you could see USA connected to Hawaii, to the Philippines, patungo to the other parts of Asia, particularly China. So when the Spanish-American War ended, there was another battle that had to happen. Many call it not the Battle of Manila. They call it the Mock Battle of Manila. August 13, 1898. The Spanish army in the Philippines was already trapped in Intramuros. Intramuros means, in Latin, within the walls. It was a walled city within Manila, built by the Spanish conquerors around 300 years earlier. It was considered at the time of the Spanish Empire to be the entire city capital of Manila. Served as the seat of government, it housed the Governor General from its founding in 1571 until 1865. Ngayon po, yung area na yan, Intramuros, is the home for famous schools and universities. Baka ho marami sa atin studied there. Lyceum, Letran, Mapua, Manila High School, Pamantasan ng Lungsod ng Maynila, Colegio of Santa Rosa, as well as historical landmarks and tourist spots like Casa Manila, San Agustin Church, and Fort Santiago. Philippine Revolutionary Army was led by Emilio Aguinaldo. They were already able to conquer several towns because si Emilio Aguinaldo was in exile po sa Hong Kong because of the Pact of Biak na Bato. He was visited by the Americans when they were about to attack Manila Bay. He boarded the Olympic flagship, and was brought to Manila. And he led the Filipinos in a guerrilla warfare, and in a few months, specific around 5 months, he was able to bring them all together, limit the Spaniards to the Intramuros area, the walled city of Manila. Ricardo T. Jose, Military History of University of the Philippines. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 3 months. Pakinggan niyo po ito. Sabi niya, they have gotten Manila almost completely surrounded to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, the Filipinos would murder them, and rape their women. So Aguinaldo was thinking, maybe they can just wait for the Americans' reinforcement. His Admiral Dewey was in the ship Olympic in Manila Bay. One quote about General Aguinaldo: the United States had come to the Philippines to protect the natives and to free the natives from the yoke of Spain. America is exceedingly well off as regards territory, revenue, and resources, and therefore, America does not need colonies. They are assuring me finally that there was no occasion for me to entertain any doubts whatever about the recognition of the independence of the Philippines by United States. What he did not know, that the battle that was about to transpire is called the mock battle because in August 12, 1898, there was already a protocol of peace that was signed in Washington, D.C. between the Spanish and the U.S. government to end the war. Included in that secret agreement was that the Spaniards would put up only a show of resistance. Mepa, it was just a show. And on pre-arranged signal, they will surrender. In this way, the governor would be spared the shame of giving up without a fight. American forces would neither bombard the city nor allow the Filipino revolutionaries to enter the city and take part of what will happen inside Intramuros. That was August 12. On August 13, the next day, U.S. Army staged a mock battle with the Spanish garrison in Manila, who then surrendered as arranged. The Philippine Revolutionary Army that was around Intramuros was excluded. They were not allowed to enter the city that was now being taken by the Americans. The Spanish garrison was disarmed and awaited repatriation, help to be sent back to Spain. This was the last battle of the Spanish War. Aguinaldo demanded access to Intramuros after the Americans occupied Intramuros. He wanted joint occupation, but he was refused, and he was warned that if his army tried to enter Manila, the Americans would fire upon them. On the next day, August 14, 1898, the Spaniards handed over the Philippines to the United States. Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city, and in response, the Filipinos retreated to a monastery north of Manila, Malolos, to organize a government independent of the United States. Let's watch the Battle of Manila.
In a little rustic cottage in the far-off Philippines sits a little black-faced maiden all alone.
Spain's army in the Philippines was trapped in Intramuros, a walled city within Manila, built by Spanish conquerors 300 years earlier. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 2 months.
They had gotten Manila almost completely surrounded to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, that the Filipinos would murder them and rape their women.
Aguinaldo hoped that Rear Admiral Dewey's fleet would bombard Intramuros and force the Spanish to surrender to the Filipinos. But Dewey had been waiting for U.S. land troops, who began arriving in July.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their redeemers, their liberators, and so for as long as Dewey's fleet was there, it was all right. But when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos began to have their doubts and became suspicious about American motives. The American soldiers, on the other hand, arrived thinking that they were really going to educate these people, and a lot of them equated the Filipinos with blacks, Negroes, and they looked down on many of them.
The Filipinos were portrayed by the press in a very different way from, say, the way that the Cubans had been portrayed prior to the U.S. intervention. What was more common was to portray the Filipinos as children, so that Uncle Sam would have to come in and establish a kindergarten and would educate the Filipinos for self-government.
The Spanish proposed surrendering to the United States in a mock battle for Manila. Few soldiers would be harmed, and the Spanish would maintain their military honor. Filipinos would be kept out of Intramuros by the U.S. Army.
The Battle of Manila was another one of these things where the Spanish did not want to simply raise their hands in the air and come out surrendering. It was almost like the reenactments that you see today of Civil War battles. Everybody knew who was going to win.
The Spaniards raised the white flag, the Americans rushed into the city as planned, and the Filipinos were left holding an empty bag. Before they knew what had hit them, they were still surrounding Manila, but Manila had changed hands into the Americans.
On August 14th, in the Church of San Agustin, the Spanish handed over formal possession of Manila to the United States. And like General Garcia at Santiago, Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city. Filipino leaders retreated to a monastery north of Manila to organize a government independent of the United States.
The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo.
And that is the reason why you could just imagine the frustration of Emilio Aguinaldo and the insurgents. I like the quote, "The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves." That was Emilio Aguinaldo. He was saying, we don't need you to govern us. You have freed us from the Spaniards governing us. Set us free and let us be self-governing. He said, because we struggled for this independence. When you came, the war of the Battle of Manila was already over. They were already contained in Intramuros. You got me out of Hong Kong to be able to lead the insurgents, and we did our part. We were able to gather them in one portion of Manila called Intramuros. That's the reason why it was just so easy for you guys to create a mock battle. There was deception that Emilio Aguinaldo felt. And that's the reason why, in reaction to that, the insurgents, the Filipinos, or the Philippine Revolutionary Army, headed to Malolos to start planning for the Malolos Convention and Constitution. And on September 15, 1898, the Philippine Revolutionary created a constitution for the first Philippine Republic. You see, the Treaty of Paris that happened, actually, there were delegates that went to Paris. But the Filipino attorney, Felipe Agoncillo, who was our representative, he wanted to join the negotiations. But he was kept out because the Americans and the Spaniards did not want the Filipinos involved. So when they signed the formal peace treaty, terms were advantageous to the U.S. because U.S. won the war. The treaty came into force on April 11, 1899, gave Cuba its independence, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States of America, and allowed the U.S. to buy the Philippines from Spain for the amount of US $20 million. This ended the 377 years rule of Spain over the Philippines. It marked the beginning of the age of United States as a world power. It ended the Spanish Empire. This Treaty of Paris weighed heavily on the U.S. election of 1900s. The issue during that time was, are we going to release the Philippines or are we continue to rule over them? That was the main issue. Lagi ho tayong laman ng dyaryo, we were always in the news. It was opposed by Democrat William Jennings Bryan because he was against imperialism. But he was fighting against the Republican President William McKinley, who upheld the treaty and eventually was reelected. There's a picture, I chose one picture in the news. It said, "Take your choice. Do you want a man who, having raised the stars and the stripes on our new possessions, will maintain them with dignity, or a man who will cut down old glory and make us the laughing stock of the world?" The bill of fare shows Uncle Sam ordering his meal. And the bill of fare includes Cuba steak, includes Puerto Rico pig, includes Philippines sandwiches, and so on. I don't know if maybe I forgot to give that to Adele. McKinley used the term benevolent assimilation to justify the taking over of the Philippines. It was to show that America was a different kind of colonizer. He claimed this was in the book In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines, written by a white guy, Carnot Stanley. He said in his book, In Our Image, they occupied Manila shortly afterwards, while McKinley continued to contemplate the future of the Philippines. He later revealed to a group of clergymen, God told him to annex the islands, that's the Philippine Islands, and do the best he could for them. In that book also, Stanley Carnot said President McKinley, quoting President McKinley, McKinley said, "There was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. And by God's grace, do the very best we could by them and our fellow men for whom Christ also died." This is so different from the claim of Emilio Aguinaldo that we are ready, we can self-govern because we have won our own struggle for independence. In the benevolent assimilation, it's a long one. I will not bore you and read the entire benevolent assimilation proclamation. The term benevolent assimilation refers to a policy of the United States towards the Philippines. It was declared by U.S. President William McKinley December 21, 1898. It succinctly stated that future control, disposition, and government of the Philippines Islands were ceded to the U.S. and that the military government is to be the whole of the ceded territory. The proclamation read in part, "Finally, it should be the earnest wish and paramount aim of the military administration to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by assuring them in every possible way that full measure of the individual rights and liberties which is the heritage of free peoples, and by proving to them that the mission of the U.S. is one of benevolent assimilation, substituting the mild sway of justice in the right for arbitrary rule." Just a few comic strips po. So, tingnan nyo na lang po ng mabuti. This, it says, "Angel of Peace, come Uncle Sam, stop chasing the Filipino boy and join the choir." It was given by the New York American and Journal. Because somehow faith, Christianity, and church were used as tools for the agendas of imperialism, U.S. imperialism. I come to us today because this setup makes us understand that it was imperative that a war would come, called the Philippine-American War. We will be entering into those two forgotten wars, Philippine-American War I, Philippine-American War II, called Bangsamoro War. We are bringing this because it is very important for us to understand the backdrop of what happened before we come to us, Filipinos entering America as Manila men of Louisiana, or as Alaskeros of Alaska, or as Sakadas, the Manos of Hawaii. I want us to understand this because napaka-importante po that we kind of understand what Winston Churchill at one point in time said. I think it is but important for us to remember what he said. One time, Winston Churchill expressed his view on heritage, and he said, "One of the signs of a great society is the diligence with which it passes culture from one generation to the next. This culture is the embodiment of everything the people of that society hold dear. When one generation no longer esteems its own heritage, we forget our culture, our history, and fails to pass the torch to its children, it is saying in essence that the very foundational principles and experiences that make the society what it is are no longer valid. To be able to navigate our future, we have to know our past. And that's the reason why Anglahi has 4 eyes. Before we can be an influence to the other nations, other races, and be able to inspire them, before we go to the 3rd rank and 4th rank of Anglahi, influence and inspiration, we must first embrace the 1st and the 2nd rank. First being, let us know our identity and let us raise up our image. Today, we reviewed our past to be able to understand our present and future relationship with America. Our scars can turn to stars. They say, the pains that we experience, I like what one person said. He said, the pains that we experience don't need to define us, but it can definitely refine us. There are now 12 million Filipinos outside of the Philippines. They're called the diasporas. 4 million of that are in America. And if there's going to be a change in our country, we need to make sure the pain turns into pearl. The nacre is formed as a response every time irritants come to hit us. Let's review this in the next segment, the next hour. But before we do that, a song that was sang last year as we celebrated or commemorated the Filipino-American Month here in the U.S. It was composed by a son, also of a diaspora. We call him Nino. And he wrote and composed a song entitled, 12 Milyon.
Growing up in the West, I've come to find that it has provided me with certain challenges, like the struggle with my own identity. Am I Filipino or American? And although that question may seem dumb to some, to me, it was a full-on contact fist fight between my East and Western identity. I grew up with a lack of voice, for I was never able to find its true self through lesson plans or textbooks. I never really knew what I could contribute to the table, so I kept my mouth shut and disappeared in what has been aptly named the invisible minority. And though it may seem like much, this is a small taste of what it's like to be Filipino living on the outside. For there are 12 million Filipinos dispersed through every corner of the world, each bearing the markings penned into their beings by the many pains, struggles, and loneliness that too often go unnoticed. Each person, a storybook in their own right, written and waiting to be told. And it is time for stories to be told. So let us stand. For soon comes the day where 12 million will rise as one. We will plant our feet firmly into the land where we are placed, raised our voices, and boldly proclaim to the world that I am one of 12 million. And we have stories to tell.
Labing-dalawang milyong kayo manggi sa bawat sulok ng mundo. Istorya mo, ikwento mo, papakinggan ko ang lakbayin mo.
Magagandang asal, wag mong kalimutan, kultura at pinanggalingan mo. Huwag kang magtakot, lumakad ng tama, talino at tapang ang aking taglay mo. Hindi ba't kaya mo
iangat ang lahi sa buhay mo? Tayo'y maging ilaw at asin sa gulo at dilim. Huwag kang magpapatalo, walang atras, ikaw ay ligtas. Sa akin ay kumapit, huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw. Oh, 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 oh. Labing-dalawang milyon kayo manggi sa bawat sulok ng mundo. Istorya mo, ikwento mo, papakinggan ko ang lakbayin mo.
Magagandang asal, wag mong kalimutan, kultura at pinanggalingan mo.
Huwag kang matakot, lumakad ng tama, talino at tapang ang aking taglay mo. Hindi ba't kaya mo iangat ang lahi sa buhay mo? Tayo'y maging ilaw at asin sa gulo at dilim. Huwag kang magpapatalo, walang aatras, ikaw ay ligtas. Sa akin ay kumapit, huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw.
Growing up, never knew my identity. Got distracted by the culture that's in front of me. Like digging deep for the roots of another tree. Till I found the truth I call my own. I know we're coming from many different circumstances, but each day let us rise up and take a chance. Till the day 12 million can stand as one. We spread out, but we under the same sun. Bring it back to the land from which you came. Keep it going and we'll never be the same. Bring it back to the land from which you came. Keep it going and we'll never be the same.
Iangat ang lahi sa buhay mo. Tayo'y maging ilaw at asin sa gulo at dilim. Huwag kang magpapatalo, walang aatras, ikaw ay ligtas. Sa akin ay kumapit, huwag kang bibitaw. Huwag kang bibitaw. Oh, oh,
that you enjoyed part 1 of our Filipino-American History Revisited.
Again, we're going to have a 15-minute break before we proceed with part 2. So go ahead at this time. You can go ahead, go to the bathroom, do whatever you need to do, go get some food. Before we start part 2, we'll begin in 15 minutes. And while you're here on the Zoom, be encouraged to go ahead and try the poll out. We have a poll from our Zoom team. They will give you that poll. Go ahead and feel free to participate on that poll as well. So again po, we'll see you in about 15 minutes.
Magandang hapon uli. I don't know what you did with your 15 minutes break. Can I see how many of you went and got coffee? Okay. How many of you took a quick lunch, the quickest lunch ever? Okay. How many of you just sat there? How many went for a restroom break? Okay. How many of you discussed what we took up, what we handled with the person beside you? Okay. I just want to ask, I'm kind of intrigued. How many of you felt that the things that we discussed today were kind of, whoa, I kind of knew that there was something like that in our history, but it kind of shocks me that it's deeper. Definitely much deeper. How many of you are reacting that way? Could I see your hands? Okay. I see a lot of hands raised. So, okay. We will be continuing now with our talk on Filipino-American History Revisited, the Paint to Pearl edition. And I'd like to start with the boost that the imperialists or the expansionists had. They won the election. William McKinley was re-elected as president. And the Treaty of Paris, the ratification of that was heavily influenced by a boost for the imperialists that was given by a man, an Englishman that lived in America, a great writer who was the opposite of Mark Twain. The man's name is Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling. The expansionists received a boost from this man who, inspired by benevolent assimilation, wrote an exhortation to the Americans. He was exhorting the Americans, share nyo, bestow the blessing of your civilization to the Filipinos. And then he warned them. He told them that even as you take this burden as the new empire, it would be a thankless task. The poem became famous. The name of the poem is White Man's Burden. If you type this in the internet, search it, go for the image, search the images, you will see a plethora of pictures of newspaper clips, cartoon clips that were published on newspapers during this time. White Man's Burden. Let's have the excerpt of the first two paragraphs. Ito pong sabi ni Rudyard Kipling. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. A few comics clips in the newspapers. One is Uncle Sam carrying babies, and the babies were labeled Puerto Rico. Ang cute natin, ano, yung Philippines. Cuba, and Hawaii. At another one, we see Uncle Sam going up the hill, bringing with him, carrying on his back in a basket, Philippines, ang itim natin dito. Hawaii, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. He seems to be following the Uncle Sam of England. The Uncle Sam equivalent of Uncle Sam in England is John Bull. And he's the guy, the fat guy ahead of Uncle Sam. Up the mountain of civilization. Referring to the white man's burden, there was a cartoon in defense of the expansionists. It was done by Charles Bartholomew, published in the Minneapolis Journal in September of 1898. Let's read. The political cartoon was a way of displaying the white man's burden in order to convince the public of a good cause to go to war in the Philippines. Political cartoons displayed the U.S. helping out the poor Pinoy to fight against the Spaniards. In this comic, Uncle Sam sees a weak Pinoy boy picking up rocks to use in his slingshots to fight against the Spaniards in his country's borders. The caption, "It makes a difference," suggests that with America's help, the fragile Pinoy army can free itself from its oppressors. But in reality, after Spain was defeated, the United States took over the Philippines as a new territory. Yung anti-expansionist or anti-imperialist came out with mga ganitong klaseng mga comics. That's one. Another one is racism that was on the shoulder of a white guy, white man's burden. And that guy that's on the shoulder was labeled as racism. Mark Twain's response to white man's burden, "And so I am an anti-imperialist. I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land. We have pacified some thousands of the islanders and buried them, destroyed their fields, burned their villages, and turned their widows and orphans out of doors. The white man's burden has been sung. Who will sing the brown man's?" On education, anti-imperialist message was showing the Philippines like a huge elephant being tied to a small thing, small post. If you understand, how do you get an elephant as big as that who can trample over a man? How can you contain him? How can you tame an elephant as huge as that? They say when he's small, tie him to a huge big tree by his hind leg, so that whenever he tries to set himself free, he would feel the pain over and over again as he relentlessly tries to free himself from the rope. That would always stay in his mind, and that will captivate his mind. It will paralyze his mind, so that when he's already big and he's tied to whatever small branch or whatnot, he will never attempt to free himself up, because he will always remember the pain that he experienced when he was young and he was trying to free himself up from the rope. Another one is this for pictures. A gorilla that was being brought up to a educational institution, and that gorilla is supposed to be us. So we ended the first session by talking about the Malolos Republic, the first Philippine Republic being established. The inauguration happened in January 23, 1899, when the Filipino insurgents, led by the first president of the Philippine Republic, who was the general of the Philippine Republic Army, Emilio Aguinaldo, when they retreated to Malolos, Bulacan, they started to build the Constitution, and after that, inaugurated the first RP Republic in a church called Barasawan Church, now known as Our Lady of Mount Carmel Parish. Of course, this was not seated down by President McKinley. The ending portion of the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation said this. Ito hong sabi nung last portion ng kanyang proclamation of benevolent assimilation. in the fulfillment of this high mission of benevolent assimilation, there must be sedulously maintained the strong arm of authority to repress disturbance and to overcome all obstacles to the bestowal of the blessings of good and stable government upon the people of the Philippines under the free flag of the United States. In other words, any opposition against the agendas of America will be handled with a firm militant arm. McKinley's response to the inauguration of the First Philippine Republic, he refused to acknowledge Aguinaldo as president of that republic. Filipino soldiers were called insurgents rather than soldiers. And there was no formal declaration of war, and therefore the conflict was labeled as insurrection. In fact, General Arthur MacArthur said this: the Filipinos are inferior race. Their guerrilla warfare is contrary to the custom of usages of war. Those who engage in it divest themselves of the character of soldiers, and if captured, are not entitled to the privilege of prisoners of war. They will be treated as criminals. February 19, 1899. Ito ho sa atin, Los Angeles Sunday Times. Shows Major Otis saying to a Pinoy, "Now you'll be good." This was in reaction to the inauguration of the First Philippine Republic in Malolos, Bulacan at Barasawan Church. Thus, the two wars happened. The first war, Filipino-American War I, happened from 1899 to 1902. We have no understanding of this. Many of us don't even know this exists. I didn't know anything of this until now. Philippine-American War II, 1902 to 1914. The first war happened mostly in Luzon. The second war happened in Mindanao, in the what you call the Bangsamoro area. Bangsa means nation, Moro means Muslim, the nation of Muslims, Bangsamoro. During the Spaniards, there were two areas of our country that were not conquered. One was the Moro region, sa baba po, sa south, and they were labeled by the Spaniards as mga Moro. And those that were at the uppermost area of Luzon, called the Cordilleras, and they were labeled by the Spaniards as the Igorots. There was a young boy by the name of Joshua Petricat. In 2016, he was 15 years old, a middle schooler. And he made a YouTube about these unforgotten wars of the Philippines. In that video, he actually said this, pakinggan niyo po. Sabi niya, and our very own history book that we used for 8th grade U.S. history, the book has 1,171 words covering the Spanish-American War, which you remember, Senator John Hay called Splendid Little War. If you remember, it only lasted for 3 months, and only 400 soldiers, American soldiers, died. In contrast, in the Philippines, the Philippine-American War lasted for around 14 years. Layo ho, yung isa, 3 months lang. Ito, 14 years. 4,000 American soldiers died, 20,000 Filipino soldiers died, and more than 250,000 Filipino civilians died. Some even say 1 million Filipinos died if you count the torture that was done in the concentration camps. The word bondocs actually came from the time of the Americans doing torture towards insurgents and those that were helping and supporting the insurgents. Anyways, eto po, he said, in that book, if you consider the Spanish-American War as a splendid little war and the Philippine War that lasted for 14 years, you could see the strong difference between these two wars. However, in the book that we use for 8th grade U.S. history, sabi niya, there were 1,171 words covering the Spanish-American War and only 164 words covering the Philippine-American War. Sabi niya, parang tinatago. Why is it so? And this was, this boy, nagbibilang ng words. Grabe, no? Pinagsagaan niya, 1,171 words, then 161 words. It makes us wonder, what was being hidden? And that's the reason why today, I'd like to look at a few massacres that happened during these 2 wars that were eradicated, obliterated, somehow hidden, considered forgotten in our history books. Let's watch first The Untold War from a middle schooler.
Hi, my name is Joshua Petrikat, your host. Welcome to Hidden History, where we will talk about events in our history that are usually not covered in our textbooks. Today, I'm going to talk about the Philippine-American War. The Philippine-American War was a war between the U.S. and Filipino revolutionaries officially from 1899 to 1902. However, fighting really continued until 1913. After the Spanish-American War, the Treaty of Paris in 1898 was signed, which gave the U.S. control of the entire Philippines archipelago, Puerto Rico, and Guam, which were previously controlled by Spain. During the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos were told by the Americans that they would be granted independence after the war if they helped fight against the Spanish. They rebelled against Spain before, and they thought that their struggle for independence was similar to the American Revolution and the struggle for independence from Britain. So they believed that the Americans would understand and let them be a sovereign nation. The American Navy destroyed the Spanish Navy at Manila Bay in May 1898. In June, Emilio Aguinaldo, a Filipino leader, declared independence and set up a constitutional government. When the Spanish surrendered Manila, the Americans would not allow the Filipinos to enter the city, which caused tensions. In Manila, American soldiers entered people's homes without a warrant and stole goods from stores, which was parallel to the behavior of English soldiers in Boston in 1775. Since the Americans wanted to conquer the Philippines and they only had control of Manila while the rest was controlled by Filipino revolutionaries, conflict between the two parties was inevitable. The U.S. claimed that they were liberators in the Philippines, but they were really just trying to conquer it because of 3 main reasons. Number 1, to have a military base in Asia where they could project American power. Number 2, to have access to Asian markets where they could sell American products in places like China. Number 3, to control natural resources of the Philippines such as rice, coffee, sugar, and tobacco. This is extremely ironic because America at that time was preaching about its democracy and self-determination, which means the right of all people to be independent and set up their own governments. The reality was that the U.S. wanted to be a world power and was practicing imperialism. This is part of the reason why we don't hear so much about this war. The other reason we don't hear much about this war is because of the way this war was conducted. In November 1901, a reporter for the Philadelphia Ledger who was in the Philippines wrote, "Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners and captives, active insurgents, and suspected people from the lads of 10 up. The idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog." Letters from American soldiers who were there also revealed what was going on. Leonard F. Adams of the Washington Regiment wrote, "I don't know how many men, women, and children the Tennessee boys did kill. They would not take any prisoners." Fred D. Sweet of the Utah Light Battery wrote, "The scene reminded me of shooting jackrabbits in Utah. Only the jackrabbits sometimes got away, but the insurgents did not." Horrible racist terms were used by the Americans to describe the Filipino people. And President McKinley claimed that after praying to God, it came to him that the U.S. should take all of the Philippines to civilize them. Torture was also used, and sometimes innocent people were pulled out of villages and tortured to get information. Entire villages were destroyed and crops burned to starve people and to prevent them from helping Filipino soldiers. Concentration camps were set up for civilians, and many people were executed, and many more were starved to death and succumbed to disease. Aguinaldo was captured in 1901, and the war officially ended in July 1902. However, a guerrilla war known as the Moro Rebellion against the American imperialists occurred until 1913. The Filipino-American War was a conflict between the American imperialists and the Filipino nationalists who only wanted freedom. In our very own history book that we use for 8th grade U.S. history, the book has 1,171 words covering the Spanish-American War, which lasted 3 months and in which 400 American soldiers died. However, in the same history book, there are 164 words covering the Philippine-American War, which officially lasted 3 years, and if you counted the years of sporadic fighting after that, it was 11 more years. 4,000 American soldiers died, 20,000 Filipino soldiers died, and 250,000 Filipino civilians died. History is important since it teaches us to learn from our mistakes. It can help us become a better country and better people. However, if we ignore some parts of our history, we will not learn from these mistakes. Thank you for watching.
Phew. Grabe, ano po? And what was being hidden? A few massacres. One of the most popular happened during the Philippine-American War I. That was from 1899 to 1902. It was in September 1901. It's called the Balangiga Massacre. The Balangiga Massacre was brought to the attention of many Filipinos when in 2017 saw a speech of Duterte, our president, who is from Visayas and from Mindanao. The State of the Nation address of 2017, President Duterte mentioned the Balangiga Massacre and asked America to give back the spoils of the war, which were the 3 Balangiga bells of the church that signaled the attack of the civilians on the Americans. If you look at the map, the Philippines is divided into 3 huge regions: Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. You see Samar there, the area of Visayas, and there was a small town by the name of Balangiga. Newspaper covered the incident and titled it "Terrible Defeat at the Hands of the Filipinos." Because of the atrocities committed against the natives, the women and the children, the natives staged a surprise attack on an infantry garrison. They killed around 48 U.S. soldiers. But the response of General Jacob H. Smith seems to be over-exaggerated. He instructed Major Littleton Waller, the commanding officer of the Marines during the time, assigned to the cleanup of the island of Samar. He was instructed, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better it will please me." He directed Samar to be converted into a howling wilderness. That's why General Jacob Smith is oftentimes referred to as Jake Howling Smith. New York Evening Journal brought one of the comic strip brought of this was by New York Evening Journal, "Kill Everyone Over 10. Criminals because they were born 10 years before we took the Philippines." Because when Jake Smith was asked who to shoot, the reply was this: "All persons who have not surrendered and were capable of carrying arms were to be shot." Who was capable? Anyone over 10 years of age. As a result, around 2,000 to 3,000 civilians were killed. It was the worst atrocity of war. General Smith was placed on trial, reprimanded, forced to retire, but never punished or sent to jail for the crime. The church bells of Balangiga were seized by the Americans as spoils of war. I'd like you to listen to this to watch this. It will contain also the SONA speech of President Duterte in the 2017 SONA, where he asked America once again to return the Balangiga bells to the Philippines. Let's watch this.
1898. Balangiga, a small town in the island of Samar in the Philippines. A garrison of the 9th Infantry of the United States controls the town and has instigated an aggressive policy of food deprivation and property destruction. Echoes of the torture of the Filipinos by American soldiers, including the infamous water torture, are widespread. The villagers decide to counterattack. Dressed as women attending a funeral, 500 Filipino men ambush the American soldiers. 48 American soldiers and 28 Filipino villagers lose their lives. A few days later, the U.S. Marines, led by Brigadier General Jacob H. Smith, arrived in Balangiga. What he ordered was simple and yet tragic: killed every male over 10 years old. In the massacre that followed, thousands of Filipinos were killed. The town of Balangiga was shelled by artillery, and its church was burned to the ground. The 3 bells of Balangiga that were used to signal to start the attack are seized as war booty. The bells of Balangiga, the most important religious relic of all Filipinos, are still in U.S. custody.
At this point, allow me to take a step back in time in 1901. In 1901, there was known as Balangiga, and that is Eastern Samar. It was the time for Philippine-American War, a combined group of Filipino villagers and guerrillas, and an effort to defend Samar Island from the alien invaders, attack and overwhelm a U.S. United States infantry garrison. 48 American officers and men were slain in the attack. On the Filipino side, the casualty count was 28 killed and 22 wounded. In retaliation, U.S. gunboats and patrols were sent to Balangiga, Samar, with the order to make a desert of Balangiga and to reduce Samar Island into an island of howling wilderness, where every male citizen from the age of 10 and above and capable of bearing arms would be put to death. The church bells of Balangiga were seized by the Americans as spoils of war. Those bells are reminders of the gallantry and heroism of our forebears, who resisted the American colonizers and sacrificed their lives in the process. Krag against Bolo. Krag was the standard rifle issue to the American troops. And that is how the historians describe. Many historians describe the Philippine-American War. That is why I say today, give us back those Balangiga bells. They are ours. They belong to the Philippines. They are part of our national heritage.
Nakat yung portion, the last portion of that speech said, isauli naman ninyo, masakit yun sa amin.
We are here at the Villamor Air Base in Pasay City, where the 3 historic bells have just been flown in from the United States 117 years after they were taken away as war booty by American soldiers. The Balangiga bells were first taken by Americans in 1901 during the heat of the Philippine-American War. In September that year, the townspeople of Balangiga in eastern Samar launched a surprise attack on American troops. Their cue for the attack, the ringing of the bells of the Balangiga church. When the ambush ended, 48 U.S. soldiers lay dead. The United States retaliated by reportedly killing men older than 10 years old and burning down the town. The bells were taken after this counterattack and were not returned despite the repeated requests from the Philippines. President Rodrigo Duterte demanded the bells return to the Philippines in his State of the Nation address in 2017.
The Philippine-American War. That is why I say today, give us back those Balangiga bells. They are ours. They belong to the Philippines.
On December 11, 2018, the bells are formally turned over by the United States to its former colony and longtime ally. The turnover is made possible by the United States Defense Authorization Act of 2018, signed by U.S. President Donald Trump. The law authorizes U.S. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis to decide on the fate of the bells, who moves forward with a historical gesture of goodwill.
We all know that that was a very painful chapter in the relations between our two countries. And hopefully the return of the bells today helps us close that chapter. There is so much wonderful things in our relationship. We really are friends, partners, and allies, and we have been for many decades. But we cannot erase what happened in the past.
The U.S. government, to my knowledge, to my reading of history, did not actually disregard or disbelieve what happened there. So there is acknowledgement. That's why the perpetrators were punished.
The bells will come home to Balangiga on December 15 in a program to be attended by President Rodrigo Duterte himself. After over a century, the Balangiga bells will no longer be silent, and they will cease to be war trophies. The return to Eastern Samar reminds us of our brave ancestors who chose to stand up to a superpower. It also reminds us to put our friendship with the Americans in perspective as superpower China vies for our attention. Rambo Talabong, Rappler, Manila.
So the return of the bells happened December 15, 2018, after 117 years. They had to take a president from the Visayas, Mindanao section, not from north, to be able to really address the U.S. The ambassador was there. U.S. Ambassador of the Philippines to the Philippines, Sung Kim. And he said, "It has been a long road home. It is my honor to be here at this closing of a painful chapter in our history." Kinakailangan somebody from the south, kasi usually the people from the north do not have the grasp of the pain that the people from Samar or from the Visayas Mindanao experience when the atrocities of war were committed. That is the first massacre that I think was being obliterated from our history. But the second, however, happened in the Philippine-American War too, the 1902 to 1914. It happened, again, let's look at the map, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. This one happened in the latter area, in the lower area called the Mindanao area, or the Maguindanao area, in that portion called the Sulu Sultanate. In the Sulu Sultanate, if you go deeper, you will find in Sulu there is an island there called Holo. That was where it happened. It is called the Budaho Massacre. In 1906, the Battle of Budaho in Holo, Sulu occurred. It is considered a war that was committed against atrocities committed against the most or the fiercest Muslims, called the Tausugs. It's also called the Moro Crater Massacre. 600 to 1,000 Moro warriors were killed. Let's look at that picture. When the men with their wives and children who climbed up into the volcanic crater of Budaho volcano on Holo Island to protect themselves were attacked and massacred by the American garrisons. The killing of 600 Moros had no great significance. It was merely a piece of public work that the U.S. Army had to do, said Roland Thomas, one of the American soldiers who participated in this massacre. This is the second that I think somehow there is an effort to erase from our history. But you see, we had a president that comes from Mindanao. He's a Davaeño. The pain is deeply felt by him. So I'd like us to watch again another video, this time referring to the Budaho massacre. Let's watch this.
Talking about Budaho, something that came into fore because President Rodrigo Duterte mentioned it a couple of times. Is this Budaho massacre something taught in school?
I went through the regular studies, and even at UP, I never heard Budaho. It's only when I started working on my doctoral dissertation that the Budaho story began to appear and became very interesting.
In any of the schools?
In any of the schools.
Then and now?
Yes, until today. It has to do probably with Mindanao studies. Okay, when we talk of Philippine history, we only deal with the stories coming from the north and the Visayas, but rarely we have not heard of the stories coming from Mindanao. So this is one classic story that all Filipinos should know and understand.
That's why you're here. We need to understand this better, analyze it, and look back to go back to 1906 when this actually happened. Actually, this year is the 110th anniversary of the Moro Massacre in Budaho. Let's begin with Budaho. What is Budaho?
Okay, but Budaho is an extinct volcano. Okay, it's not really that high, so it's easy in a sense for the Tausug, okay, the Moros from Holosulu, to climb in the resistance against the Americans. So that's it. It's a distinct, and like typical rebels, they choose something outside wherein they cannot be easily reached by people that they...
That's their fortress, the Budaho.
That's their fortress.
Which is a volcano, and they stayed in the crater. Is that correct?
Near the crater
rather, yeah. And my understanding also is that Budaho is just about, is it true, 6 to 7 kilometers away from Holosulu?
Not far.
So that's quite near.
That's right, near.
All right. 1906, a number of Moros trekked the volcano, this extinct volcano, to defy American rule, is it?
That's right. Technically, it's sovereignty. Okay, so I think that the turning point there is the Sidula, as they call it. Okay, for the Tausug, Sidula symbolizes sovereignty. When you start paying taxes to a foreign group that has occupied Holo, so they don't want that.
So they did not want the Sidula.
They don't want to pay the Sidula, and in fact, they call it. It's a history of Lupasug. It's a silsila of Lupasug. There is a narration. If you pay tax, when you die, you ride on a pig. So for them, the idea of, okay, it's not sophisticated Islam, but for them, riding on a pig is offensive. It will make you impure. So that in itself, in the consciousness of people, is there is only one sovereign. It's only Allah. So when we pay taxes or sidula to the Americans, we are accepting their sovereignty over our Allah.
Instead of Allah.
Instead of Allah.
So that was the perception of the Moros then. Having to pay revolutionary taxes to the Americans was almost like a contradiction to what they believed in.
Exactly.
The sovereign, the only sovereign being, spirit, or person for that matter is Allah.
Allah. And it's interesting, during the battle itself, okay, it's documented.
Before we go to the battle,
yes.
let's go chronological. So, how many Moros actually trekked Budaho and somehow create a fortress there?
Yeah, it started, so it's not only a 3-day thing. We can go as far as maybe 10 months or a year, or go as far as 3 years ago, because there are 3 groups of tausug, or groups that went up, because there were 3 resistances. Okay, like it started with Panglima Hasan of 2003, and there is Adat.
Okay.
Yeah, there is Datu Usap, and eventually Datu Pala.
So those 3 are almost like the leaders of these people who went up to Budaho.
Oh, right. So when their leaders, in a sense, they lost their battles against Americans in that area, all the followers wanted to sustain. They understood probably what their datus were telling them. The concept of, we cannot be under these people. It will not make us, it will lessen our identity as Muslims. It does not make us good Muslims if we submit to a foreign group. So there is a theological, it's interesting. They're very simple people, but their theology is very clear, that there is only one Allah and we are sovereign under Him.
Did they think that it was a sin to do that as well, to follow the cedula?
Precisely. It's against Islam.
It's against Islam. So originally, there were about 600 of the Moros who went to Budaho. Trekked Budaho, lived there, and I understand that they planted corn, or was it potatoes or rice? They started to live in that volcano, 600 of them. And then eventually, that ballooned to about 1,000 Moros?
That's right.
Okay.
It was really a village. And I mean, when you think of a volcano, extinct volcano, source of water and probably vegetation is rich. So they managed to create a little, like a little barangay or a little village up there.
And can you imagine that was in 1906?
1906.
Yeah. Well, let's first listen to this, Doctor. We want to listen to the statement of President Rodrigo Duterte on September 5th. He was in Davao getting ready to go to the ASEAN Summit in Laos. He was asked by a journalist what he would tell President Barack Obama if asked about extrajudicial killings in the country. Mr. Obama was also attending the ASEAN Summit and was scheduled to meet with Mr. Duterte. And as we know, that meeting with Mr. Obama was cancelled.
The Philippines is not a vassal state. We have long ceased to be a colony of the United States. Alam mo, marami diyang mga sa kolumnista, they look upon Obama and the United States as if we are the lapdogs of this country. I do not respond to anybody but to the people of the Republic of the Philippines. Wala pong pakialam sa kanya. Who is it to confront me? As a matter of fact, he has to America has one too many to answer for the misdeeds in this country.
Then the battle happened.
Okay.
Were the Moros armed themselves? Because I understand that the Moros themselves had guns, rifles, cannons. Is this true?
Paltik, little guns here and there, and much of it's Chris, or the other times they used to call barong, a small bolo. Okay.
There were no cannons.
No cannons.
No such
They
thing.
were so inferior to what the Americans were using. And in fact, they were even shelled earlier before the Americans went up. So it's almost like when you look at it, it was a massacre. They cannot fight for them against a more superior force.
And then 600 Moros died.
And more, as some historians will claim. It's just 600 could be a conservative estimate, but 600 plus at least died.
And what was that battle like? Because from what I read, it was as if the women wore men's clothes, fought with their husbands, their children in tow, and then it was as if it was an accomplishment for somebody, at least a Filipino, to die with one American dead beside him or her. Is that true?
I think those who died at Budaho, they knew what they were fighting for. And they are willing. So it's almost not like exclusive to the men. Even women believe in that. We cannot be subservient to any foreign group. So they were there, dressed in men, and they knew they cannot win a battle with just bolo and barong, but they continued on.
So that summarizes the Budaho massacre. These are the things that somehow were hidden from us. Hindi ho natin alam itong mga to. It takes a president from the South to bring it out this way, in the sense that he was demanding an apology from America. Another one is the Battle of Budbagsak, but we're not going to discuss that any longer. It happened in 1913, Holosulu. It was the last battle of the Philippine-American War, Part 2, Bangsamoro War. There were around 2,000 Moros that died, including 196 women and 340 children. All in all, people were estimating, historians were estimating that there were around 1 million Filipinos that died during this time of the wars. Considering people died not only during the battle, engaged in the battle, but also because of the tortures and the atrocities that were happening outside of the battles. We see that, for example, here in the Philippine-American War of February 4, 1899, that one of the things that was featured in the newspapers during that time. Now, we talk about this because it is but important for us that when we talk about the Philippine-American history, we the Filipinos here in the diaspora, particularly the 4 million Filipinos that are living here in America, as part of the 12 million, we're 1/4. There are 12 million Filipinos outside of the Philippines. 4 million of that nakatira ho dito sa Amerika. When we trace our Philippine-American history, we oftentimes start with the Louisiana, Manila men. But friends, we have to go way back past that. Way back before that. And the reason for that is because of the Pearl of the Orient journey, the pain to pearl journey. I remember Helen Keller saying this. It's very, very important. There are things that we can learn from pain, from adversities. And I remember Helen Keller saying this: character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened. Let's repeat that. Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. It can only be developed through the experience of trial and suffering. That's only the time that the soul can be strengthened, visions cleared, ambitions inspired, and success achieved. I like what Neil Strauss said: great things never come from comfort zones. Khalil Gibran said, out of sufferings have emerged the strongest souls and the most massive characters. They're seared with scars. And so as we now journey and talk about the 12 million diaspora, as we watch the Filipino-American diaspora story, this is the backdrop of those journeys that we should never forget. In fact, we should embrace. Let's watch Filipino-American diaspora story.
A Filipino-American story. Before the founding of America, even before the settlement of Jamestown, there were Filipinos in what is now known as the continental United States. Throughout history, Filipino-Americans have led movements, confronted injustices, and have created world-shaking ideas. They disrupt. So why is their history largely untold? We must tell them to unsettle the pages of U.S. history. They reveal who we are as Americans. People from the Philippines, which was under Spain, first landed in California as part of the Spanish galleons. On future sailings, many jumped ship to form settlements in what would be known as Louisiana. It is a fact. Filipino Americans have been in the United States for centuries. In 1898, the United States entered into war against Spain and took possession of the Philippines, paying Spain $20 million. To rationalize colonization, American officials referred to this as benevolent assimilation, claiming to protect Filipinos' rights and liberties. But the Filipino people, who were already fighting for independence from Spain, resisted U.S. colonization. This was known as the Philippine-American War. Fought with extreme violence, General Jacob H. Smith notoriously ordered his soldiers to kill every Filipino boy over 10 years old. Many Americans opposed this, including Mark Twain and the African-American Buffalo Soldiers who were sent to the Philippines for battle. Somehow, America needed to justify this war. They even transported some Filipinos to the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair for display. Erased from our history, the Forgotten War became the catalyst of Filipino migration to the U.S. Because of the Philippines' colonial status, the people became a major source of cheap labor. And so, Filipinos migrated to Hawaii as early as 1906 to work in sugar plantations. By the 1920s, many Filipino laborers also came to the West Coast to become a driving force behind America's agricultural industry. But many of these labor migrants were met with racial hostility. White Americans accused Filipino men of stealing their jobs and women. Filipinos faced down mobs, beatings, and murder, yet they resisted this oppression. Filipino towns such as Stockton's Little Manila were formed to serve as safe havens up and down the West Coast. Labor strikes demanded fair wages and working conditions. Under pressure, Congress greatly restricted the migration of Filipinos and promised independence for the Philippines. Through it all, Filipinos continued to persevere. World War II was a time of great upheaval for both the Philippines and Filipino-Americans. Japan bombed American bases in the Pacific, at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines, prompting the U.S. to enter the war. As a colony, the Philippines allied with America. President Roosevelt established the United States Armed Forces in the Far East to enlist nearly 250,000 Filipinos into the U.S. Armed Forces, a decisive move that helped win the Pacific Theater. After the war, America granted independence to the Philippines. Filipinos who joined the armed forces in the U.S. gained the right to citizenship. Filipino veterans in the Philippines were promised citizenship as well and military benefits. However, the passing of the 1946 Rescission Act broke that promise for many of those veterans. American military bases remained in the Philippines recruiting Filipinos. At one point, there were more Filipinos in the U.S. Navy than the Philippine Navy. Many of these Navy sailors came to America. Filipino women married to U.S. military men also migrated to the U.S. These women raised families, bought land, and created communities. They built the next generation of Filipino-Americans. In 1965, an important legislation greatly expanded immigration quotas. By 1970, the Filipino population had ballooned. In a decade, it had more than doubled. Many of these new immigrants were women and professionals. In the 60s, Filipino Americans fought for equality alongside Black Power and Chicano movements. In California, Larry Itliong, Philip Veracruz, and other organizers led a strike against grape businesses. Filipinos convinced Cesar Chavez and his association to join the strike. Filipinos started the 1965 Delano Grape Strike, and together with Latinos, they had one of the most successful strikes against agribusiness in history. The younger generation were also in revolt. San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley students, including young Filipino Americans, led a strike that established ethnic studies. Many other groups organized to serve the Filipino-American community. There are now over 4 million Filipinos in the United States. FONS, the Filipino-American National Historical Society, tells the stories of the Filipino-American experience. Established in 1982 by Dorothy Ligo Cordova and Fred Cordova, FONS saw the value in documenting Filipino-American history, honoring October as Filipino-American History Month. And why wouldn't they? Filipino-Americans persevere for a just and prosperous society no matter the stakes. Whether they excel in public service, head the Filipino food movement, inspire us as sports heroes and as creative artists, whether they spark innovation across industries, lead movements for justice, fight for national recognition and the Congressional Gold Medal for Filipino World War II veterans, Filipino Americans disrupt, and their stories cannot fade. No matter what forces make us forget, we recover them, reveal, and speak about their stories. Because as we make history, we must also tell it to the world.
Ang ganda, ano po? And that's the reason why as we end today, I would like to highlight a few because there's just too much. I was choosing some profiles that we can just end our teaching today on the Pain to Pearl edition of the Filipino-American History Revisited. And I just thought of bringing to us two of these profiles. And I also would like to mention the Manila Men of Louisiana. As mentioned a while ago, the first Filipinos that came here came here to America before the Americans colonized the Philippines. It was during the time of the Spaniards. That's why it was sometime around 1570s to 1700s. They were called the Louisiana Manila Men. These were Filipino deserters and escaped slaves of the Spanish Manila galleon trade. They formed settlements in Louisiana called Manila Village. If you remember po, we have no time to talk about this. I talked about this lengthily when I handled longer hours of Filipino-American history. Pero napakaganda pong tingnan itong Manila Acapulco galleon ship that somehow was able to connect Asia to Americas to Europe and do a trading amongst these nations through the galleon ships that would circle from Manila to Acapulco to Manila to Acapulco. There were slaves there. There were Filipino deserters in those ships. And they escaped. These were the ones that formed what we call the Manila villages in Louisiana. They were called the Manila Men. Later, they were called the Tagalas. They built houses and structures that were raised on stilts above the water. And these structures, platform structures, they were called shrimp drying platform structures. These structures became one of the forerunners of the Louisiana shrimp drying industry. Now, I like to see this. The reason why I chose this as one of our examples is because they came 1570s. So when the Americans eventually bought us for $20 million and came to our country, and they had to somehow justify their presence in our country, they took advantage of a world fair that was happening in Louisiana in the year 1904 and brought around 1,000 Filipinos, Igorots, 1,002 Filipinos to be exact. It was called the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, known as St. Louis Fair, World's Fair, an international exposition held in St. Louis, Missouri, United States, from April 30 to December 1, 1904. Isipin nyo na lang po, kung kayo po yung mga Pilipino na nasa Louisiana during the time. 40 years after, not 40, siguro kung, pasensya na mahina ho ako sa math, 400 years ba yan? After. And you're there. Yung embarrassment po na nakuha ng mga taong ito. Remember this, it was a big fair. Total number of people who attended, nearly 19.7 million people. More than 60 countries and 43 of the then 45 American states maintained exhibition spaces at that fair. You know how much they spent for that fair? Total federal and local funds totaled $15 million. It was a big thing. And you see, in that St. Louis World Fair, there was a Philippine exposition called the Igorot Village. 1,002 Pinoys from the Philippines, Igorots to be exact, were brought there to show dances and lifestyles, culture, and food of the Igorots. Maybe we can show one picture of the dances happening. And that's the reason why it was such a relief in 2012 when the Manila men were finally recognized and honored because they were considered the pioneers of the dried shrimp industry of Louisiana, which generates an annual income of 1.3 billion. So there's pictures po of the unveiling of the historical marker for Manila Village in Barataria Bay, southern Louisiana, June 16, 2012. This was the time, the unveiling of the historical marker for the Manila Village in Barataria Bay, southern Louisiana, last June 16, 2012, was the time that the pioneers, Manila men, of the dried shrimp industry of Louisiana were acknowledged. Kasi ho yung shrimp industry now generates an annual income po of around $1.3 billion. The Manila men were considered the forerunners of the Louisiana shrimp drying industry. I'd like to read what is stated in that historical marker. Today, more than 4 million Filipino-Americans lived in the United States, with nearly 12,000 Filipino-Americans living in Louisiana. Not only were Filipinos some of the state's first residents, but Filipino-Americans are also credited with pioneering the state's dried shrimp industry, which was the precursor of Louisiana's thriving shrimping industry. Today, Louisiana has become one of the nation's top shrimp producers, with the industry generating an annual income of $1.3 billion for the Pelican States. You could just imagine po what we went through during the 1904. As the Filipinos were made as part of the exhibit, just to be able to justify the presence of the Americans in the Philippine Islands. Friends, the pain to pearl. I'd like to once again quote, "Great things never come from comfort zones. Out of sufferings have emerged the strongest souls. The most massive characters are seared with scars." I'd like to talk to us about 1906. When America took over the Philippines in 1898, one of the reasons for the colonization was to have cheap labor, and the Filipinos became a major source of this cheap labor. So Filipinos migrated to Hawaii as early as 1906 to work in sugar plantations under the Hawaiian Sugar Plantation Association. I visited one of those plantations that have turned a certain portion of it into a museum. Ayan po kami. Ano po? Kasi laki ko yung baboy dun sa mesa. And when we were there po, I saw a few of the things that were, a few quotes that were placed in the museum. One is was this by Pedro Ponce. Sabi niya, "If I'm still alive, I'll be back after 3 years." And you're wondering, bakit na sinasabing if I'm still alive? Mahirap ba ang buhay? Was it difficult being a sakada in Hawaii? That's what I told my mother before I left the Philippines. One of those that was posted was this: Filipinos, sometime around 1906 to 19, and you could see the marker. The first immigrants were mostly single men. Sporadic immigrations by Filipino women created small family communities that embraced the large bachelor community and developed a new extended kinship network. I like to talk about this, the sakadas. I don't know if you would remember, but we had an Anglahi commemoration of what the Smithsonian Institute in 2006 called the commemoration of the first centennial of the Filipino diaspora. Because for Smithsonian Institute, the first group of Filipinos, official group of Filipinos that migrated to America were the 15 sakadas that arrived in Hawaii on December 20, 1906. That's why in 2006, they celebrated or commemorated the first centennial of the Filipino diaspora. The Filipino laborers became known as sakadas. The wave of farm workers brought approximately 24,000 men, 3,066 women, and 2,330 kids to Hawaii between the years of 1906 and 1909. When I was going through the museum, I saw certain portions that talked about the contracts between the workers and the Ilocano workers and the Hawaiian Sugar Plantation Association, HSPA. In the Philippines, the contracts between the workers and HSPA were translated into Ilocano. The contract specified that they would receive free transport for themselves and their families, 3 years employment, free housing, and free water, fuel, medicine, and health care. They will be paid at the rate of $16 a month for the first year. And I think this is what Pedro Ponce was referring to. They will be working 10 hours a day, 26 days each month. If you compute that, that would be around 60 hours a week of hard labor under the sun. If you're renovated here, you understand how it is to do hard labor under the sun for a few hours. The rate of pay was lower than all the other workers in Hawaii who were getting at least $18 a day. The Filipinos were dealt with differently. They were considered inferior to other ethnic groups. The other ethnic groups were assigned into different types of work. Apat na uri po. The Hayoles, basically the whites, they took management positions. The Lunas, and it's very important that we remember the Lunas. Basically, they were the Spanish and the Portuguese in the plantations. They were the plantation overseas. They were the ones in charge of us, the Pinoys. We have to remember them. The Japanese, the Japanese, were assigned to technical and mechanical jobs. And the Sakadas, the Filipinos, the laborers of the field, lowest job post in the plantation. When we were there in the plantation, I saw a whip that was displayed. Whips were used not only on the animals, but also by some of the Lunas, on the workers they felt were not working fast or hard enough. The Lunas scolded the workers for slight mistakes they made in their work, and some of them felt the pain as they were whipped by several abusive Portuguese Lunas. In short, the Luna, the king in the fields, wrought havoc on the physical and mental beings of the Filipinos. They were shouted and harassed. The Lunas fined, suspended, and fired workers. The Lunas set workers' earnings and assigned them to other jobs. But sometimes the workers slowed down when the Luna was nowhere to be seen. There were instances probably when their supervisor might have scolded them, "You're so slow, hurry up, we're late on our schedule," or whatever. Yes, the Lunas scared and intimidated the workers. This is the pain. But imagine if you are a laborer from Urdaneta, Pangasinan Province, Philippines, and you came to Hawaii as one of those workers who work in the plantations of Hawaii up around 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There was one from Pangasinan. He had a son who became the governor of Hawaii in 1994. He was the first Filipino-American to be elected governor of state when he won in the Hawaii November 1994 gubernatorial race. His name, Benjamin Ben Cayetano. The boy was taught to see a larger world, to dream impossible dreams, to be responsible for his own race, to learn hard work, and to practice discipline and due diligence. He was sent to Los Angeles, California, studied in LA Harbor College, UCLA, BA in Political Science, Loyola Law School in LA, earning a 1975 Juris Doctorate. And in 1994, the people of Hawaii elected him as their governor and was re-elected to his second term. But this is so beautiful, the pain turning into pearl. Beginning with his gubernatorial induction in 1995, Cayetano was regarded as the guiding force who led Hawaii out of 8 years of economic depression. The Cato Institute's 2000 Fiscal Policy Report card, that is the card that measures officials' performance, ranked him the 7th among all 50 state governors. He was number 7. Along with his fiscally responsible tax-cutting strategies for Hawaii, Governor Cayetano has harbored an industrious platform achieving prosperity in the area of housing, education, technology, economic development, crime, drug prevention, environmental protection, healthcare, and agriculture. One time, he said this: "We collectively have within our grasp the potential to break the barrier and open the door for a better life for our children and grandchildren." And then he said this, feeling the responsibility for his own race: "I want to be the role model. I want to help encourage them to set higher goals, dream bigger dreams, and to not only reach for the stars, but to touch those stars." And then he said, "It's our turn, our chance. Let us reach our goals together. We can do it." Pain to pearl. You said a while ago, great things never come from comfort zones. The father's pearl was his son by the name of Ben Cayetano. So, and I'd like to bring another one from a son of a veteran of World War II. We know for a fact that during World War II, the Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese. In retaliation, America bombed Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And because of that, the Philippines was invaded by the Japanese. The infamous Bataan March happened. During the World War II, over 250,000 Filipinos fought in defense of the U.S. against the Japanese, where more than half of those Filipinos died. Because the Philippines was a commonwealth of the U.S. before and during the war, Filipinos were legally American nationals. They were promised all the benefits afforded to those serving in the armed forces in the United States. However, in 1946, President Truman signs the first Rescission Act, denying the military benefits to those serving in the Philippine Commonwealth Army and the guerrillas. When the war was over, the promises was rescinded. It was taken away. Why? Bakit kaya? Because the United States gave the Philippines $600 million to rebuild the nation, particularly Manila, that was bombed by the Japanese during the invasion. That's the reason why Filipino vets were oftentimes referred to as the second-class veterans, because of the 66 countries allied with the U.S. during the war. 66. The Philippines is the only country that did not receive military benefits from the United States. The veterans here in America fought for their rights. And after 64 years, most of these veterans maybe were around 85 years old and older. In 2009, they were finally compensated. Section 1002 of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act provided for a one-time $15,000 lump sum for the surviving veterans who are U.S. citizens, and a $9,000 lump sum settlement for non-citizens. Eligible people had 1 year from the time of passage of the bill para mag-file ng claim. $198 million was set aside for this payment. That was after nearly 75 years. The Filipino veterans of World War II were finally acknowledged and compensated. Grabe, ano po? Maybe we can show a video of the Filipino veterans.
Future generations need to know about the sacrifice, about the hardship, and about all the work that was done so that they could live in peace today.
A 250,000 Filipinos served as an integral part of U.S. forces in the Philippines and in the Pacific Theater. As part of that arrangement, they were promised that they would be treated as U.S. veterans. They would receive benefits.
I have joined the underground movement as a member of the guerrilla forces during the entire period of World War II.
Whenever you mention the Filipino soldier, what comes to mind is Bataan, Corregidor, the Death March. These are all stories of defeat. But remember, the Filipino soldier won. He was part of the triumph, the victory.
Our unit had the opportunity to participate in the liberation of more than 500 American prisoners of war.
They were part of the victories in World War II, and yet their service has been minimized and forgotten.
Unfortunately, after the war, those benefits were revoked by an act of Congress, and the majority of the veterans received no compensation, no recognition of their contributions during the war.
Our sacrifices were not recognized.
Their stories have never had any platform to be told. For 63 years, they waited for broken promises.
Finally, after many years of seeking a resolution, at the beginning of 2009, the U.S. Congress offered some small compensation to the Filipino veterans of World War II. 2009, therefore, is an opportunity for us to imbue this gesture with a deeper sense of meaning. We'd like to honor them, give dignity to their sacrifice and heroism, and recognize them both here and in the Philippines.
They, at this point in their lives, need to hear that their services, their sacrifices, and that their hardships were recognized.
In December of this year, 2009, the Global Peace Convention is taking place in Manila. That we hope can be a great opportunity for us to bring recognition to those Filipino World War II veterans. The best way to honor a legacy is to contribute to the future. And so I think that Americans should support the Global Peace Convention because of the important friendship between the American and Philippine people.
One of those that served there in the World War II, a war veteran, a hero of the Bataan March, came here to America through Hawaii. He brought his son, who was 11 years old then. He raised that son with a deep love for America, despite the fact that they were fighting still to be recognized and to be compensated. Yes, that's the guy. The name of the son was General Antonio Taguba. His father raised him to have a deep love to serve America, and thus he entered the military. And yet, he made sure the son had the knowledge of the atrocities of the Filipino-American wars and the injustice done towards the Filipinos. This father might perhaps had journeyed through the pain to pearl journey, his pearl, his son. The son perhaps have been taught to have a stand whenever injustice was committed. His son is a retired Major General in the United States Army, one of the only 2 American citizens of Philippine birth to be promoted to general officer rank in the U.S. Army. But this was the son that was taught courageously to speak the truth when needed. So Taguba is best known for authoring the Taguba Report, an internal United States Army report on abuse of detainees held at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. The report was leaked, then published in 2004. Taguba again made national headlines in June 2008 when he accused the Bush administration of committing war crimes in a preface to a report by Physicians for Human Rights on prisoner abuse and torture in America's military prisons. Naalala ko tuloy yung quote ni Steve Maraboli. It is when I struggled that I strengthened. It is when challenged to my core that I learned the depth of who I am. It might be during those times that they were still waiting to be acknowledged and compensated, that the Father was discovering who He was. Steve Maraboli, it is when I struggled that I strengthened. It is when challenged to my core that I learned the depth of who I am. Adam Braun, the self-discovery begins where the comfort zone ends. That's when we discover who we are. And I like what Bob Marley said. You never know how strong you are until being strong is your only choice. As the family got to know even more their identity, their values, the principles, General Antonio Taguba made his stance. Now in his early 70s, he has retired. October 25, 2017, Congress attributed to the Filipino veterans of World War II the highest civilian honor. The Filipino veterans became eligible to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. Hindi ko na nahabol yung mga pictures kaninang umaga. But beautiful pictures po of the Congressional Gold Medals. Referring to that, General Taguba said, the medal is not just a piece of metal. It symbolizes the service and sacrifice of the Filipino soldiers who fought under the American flag and made the ultimate sacrifice. That was his dad. Their stories are deeply moving and compelling, and they need to be enshrined, not just in Philippine history, but in American history, and preserved for posterity so the next generation of Americans will learn what happened not only during the war, but after the war, that we were not compensated because of the Rescission Act. Nowadays, this general that is retired would oftentimes be the guest of honor in events where the veterans are honored. Like in April 10, 2018, Day of Valor in Washington. General Taguba was the guest of honor. Let's show the picture of him shaking the hand of 101-year-old Celestino Alameda, the oldest living Filipino veteran in Washington, D.C. area during the Bataan Day commemoration at the National World War II Memorial, Tuesday, April 9. General Taguba, I can think of no other place I would rather be today than at this ceremony, remembering with you the courage and sacrifice, the resilience, the strength of the defenders of Corregidor and Bataan. Grabe, ano po? These were the pearls. They took the pain to Pearl Journey. Maybe not forget that, because pain brings us motivation to be the pearl of the pains of those that have gone ahead of us as pioneers of the 4 million diasporas, Filipino-Americans, or the 12 million diasporas, the entire world. I will just end by saying this. I don't have time to go into the nurses. Nowadays, the Filipinos, because when America came to the Philippines, one part of the benevolent assimilation is to educate and civilize the Filipinos. In the area of public health, the Philippines quickly developed medical labor force by building more than 10 nursing schools in less than 10 years. Filipino nursing students were required to learn English and then Western medical practices from American teachers. And year after year, new classes of American-trained English-speaking Filipino nurses graduated from nursing schools and inadvertently prepared Filipino nurses to work in the United States. They are now the frontliners in the battle against the pandemic, not only here in America, but globally in the entire world. I'd like to end with a video that was sent to me by one of our life coaches, a message of New York Mayor de Blasio honoring the Filipino nurses, the frontliners of the pandemic. Let's watch this.
Asian Americans are not a monolith. No people of color are. That's why it's important that we lift up and pay homage to your community, to this community individually. Today, we celebrate the start of Filipino-American History Month, and we're proud to be the home for more than 80,000 Filipino New Yorkers who make this city a richer, stronger place. And this year, we recognize the incredible work and sacrifice of all of you who served on the front lines of the COVID-19 pandemic. Filipinos make up the second largest Asian community in America. So many of you serve as doctors and nurses and health workers. More than a quarter of the immigrant nurses in our country are from the Philippines. So it's no exaggeration to say we literally would not have survived the COVID-19 pandemic without all of you, our Filipino brothers and sisters. I ask all New Yorkers to join me in celebrating the culture and contributions of our Filipino community. You keep our city moving forward, and you keep us progressing during one of the greatest challenges of our time. Thank you for protecting us.
This ends po our Paint to Pearl edition of Filipino-American History Revisited. I would like to just end with Jose P. Rizal, our national hero, with his quote on the youth. Where are the youth who will consecrate their golden hours, their illusions and their enthusiasm to the welfare of their native land? We are Filipinos here in America. We are Filipinos spread out in the entire world. It is so important that we know and do diligent study of our past, that we might have the fuel of pain to make us continue to persevere in the journey of pain to pearl. May we live up to that beautiful name. We are the Pearl of the Orient. I just would like to thank you po for joining us, especially those that are from Europe, for staying awake for the entire time. And I just would like to thank everyone, the unsung wonks, the willing unknowns of this event to come out with such a beautiful way of celebrating or commemorating the Filipino-American month this October. Maraming salamat po. Thank you so much po.
During this pandemic, we believe that we've been seeing the best of humanity in our fearless frontliners, as we have seen them on our Zoom screen, people who have been tirelessly choosing to serve others before themselves. And we have a special treat for you. Our next video shows the stories of the heroes among us. So we hope that you sit down, tune in, and really listen to their stories. So let's watch this.
If you're Filipino living in the US, chances are you have a family member, friend, or loved one who is a nurse. Consider these statistics. About 4%, or approximately 150,000 nurses in the US are Filipino. If you live in California, there's a good chance that you have at some point received medical care from a Filipino-American professional. Nearly 20% of registered nurses in California identify as Filipino. In the East Coast, 1 in 4 Filipinos in the New York, New Jersey region works in the healthcare industry. The history behind why there are so many Filipino-American nurses in the United States is rooted in Americans' colonial history with the Philippines. When the Philippines became a U.S. territory at the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the U.S. set up nursing schools that offered an American curriculum in the Philippines. American education was part of the U.S. plan to quote-unquote civilize the Philippines. Since then, short-staffed hospitals, particularly from the West and East Coasts, heavily recruited Filipino nurses for decades. To this day, the Philippines continues to be the leading exporter of professional nurses to the US. Filipino-American medical professionals serve an integral role in the US healthcare and have overcome great obstacles to establish a legacy of care in this country. This history matters because hospitals that have a huge influx of COVID-19 patients have nurses to care for them, largely because America opened its border to Filipino nurses. With the coronavirus pandemic, the tireless work nurses do have been placed under the spotlight, and with it, rightful recognition. Because many Filipino-American nurses work in acute or critical care, some of the most dangerous and stressful nursing work, Filipino-American nurses are put disproportionately on the front lines. According to recent reports, Filipino-American nurses account for 1/3 of frontliner COVID-19 deaths. However, despite the risks, many Filipino-American healthcare workers, out of selflessness and passion, press on in order to continue serving their communities. From taking on more shifts to becoming like family to their isolated patients. Many Filipino-American nurses no longer see their medical service just as a path to forward their careers, but more importantly, as a way of fulfilling their callings. How are our fearless frontliners turning their pain into pearls? These are their stories.
Before COVID, you just go inside the room, you open the door, and then you give whatever you need. You do whatever you need to do with your patient. Pero ngayon po, lalo na kapag suspected po na COVID patient, sa labas pa lang po yung preparation physically, para naubos na po lahat yung energy nyo kasi magsusuot po kayo ng madaming mga PPEs. And then, pagdating nyo po dun sa loob, syempre hindi nyo po in-expect kung ano po yung situation ng pasyente. Sometimes hindi po sila masyadong makahinga, hindi po sila, yung pong sobrang uneasy sila. So kailangan i-compose nyo rin po yung sarili nyo para mapadama nyo rin po sa kanila na hindi po sila nag-iisa, na nandun po kayo para tulungan sila na makatawid dun sa nararamdaman nila.
So our ICU was converted into a COVID ICU, that 40 beds. Right now, we are understaffed, and we need to help other ICUs cope up with the nursing job that they need. So I was assigned in our unit. Then, like before 11 p.m., I was pulled out to the other ICU to take care of other patients. Then, in the middle of the night again, I was pulled out again and transferred to other ICUs to help with another patient to admit. Even then, it's still a blessing that you are there to help. What I put in my mind is that, Lord, this is your purpose, that you put me in that situation, and then you can see after you're there, your patients get better, and then the treatments that's supposed to be needed, you are part of that. There's some article that you have mentioned that the death rate for Filipino nurses are high, like 30% or more, because Filipinos are frontliners of frontliners. Yeah, when, like in my case, I'm new. We are working hard compared with others. If we are working three days, sometimes we are working 5 days. If they are receiving 2 patients, sometimes we are taking care of 3. And when our managers or superiors ask us to do the work, we did not say no. In fact, we are even what do we call that? Helping those with their schedules. If they cannot do, we take over the schedules. So the harder part is that if they are doing an extra mile, 1 mile, we are doing 2 to 3.
Dito talaga sa New York, it was really at the height of the COVID, or left and right, may namamatay or may dinadala sa ospital. At that time, even in the field that I'm with in dialysis, you can see the fear in the eyes of those patients. The only thing that I think is they're looking into to my eyes, into our eyes. Takot ba kami? Is there fear that is going on sa amin? But God was so good. Yung fear, He changed it to strength to fight it and to help them as much as we can. And we were really helping them out because they're really grasping for breath, as if yung parang feeling nila yung na-choke na sila. It was really something na, I have to do something. Lord, help me. Teach me what to do. All those things na nagrarana sa isip mo. But we were able to go through that. And the patients were so happy. And you can feel that they become strong because they're confident that you're there. That there's somebody who is there watching them and caring for them and will be there in case na worst comes to worst. There's really joy that I'm being used for those moments. Yan, para sa akin, that is already a pearl. Filipino to be used for these patients na iba't ibang lahi. They believe that Filipinos are good caretakers and they trust us. This is a calling. And para sa akin is, Lord, you've been faithful to me all through my life. I was called for this, and kung ano man mangyari sa akin, pinapasaya ko na lahat. And I'm willing to, honestly, sabihin man nila ang corny ko, pero it's like I'm willing to die. This is it. If I was called for this, and then at least I was called for a purpose, and at least I'm doing something for the greater good.
The governor of California actually designated our hospital po to be the COVID or a surge hospital dito sa Northern California. They released us again for a month or two because there was an outbreak sa prisons. So we have a lot of patients po, COVID patients, nadala din po sa ICU, sa critical care po, na galing po ng prison. And most of our patients there po are really hardcore criminals. They're in the death row. Most of them po are also on the respirator. How do we take care of these people then? Na parang sabihin natin na they are prisoners po. They have, sabihin natin, may ginawa sila sa community, may ginawa sila sa mga tao, or they could be a murderer or rapist, something ganyan. And then we take care of them or what? Or do we need to spend more time with them or give them the same care that we take care of I would say, civilians? Sa akin po, napag-usapan po namin, we have to take care of this. We really have to take care of them. Kasi wala naman tayong pinipili as nurses. We have to take care of them. No matter their background, we still have to take care of them. May mga nagmamahal din sa kanila. Mahal din naman sila ni Lord. It doesn't matter what they did, but we still have to treat them equally. It doesn't matter because they're still human beings. Recently po, a few weeks ago po, I was exposed po sa COVID. I have to isolate myself po. But the hardest part of it is because, like I said earlier po, is that I live with my mom, that she's in her 70s. So just telling her that I was exposed, I need to explain to her why I need to stay in my room for weeks. Telling her that was my biggest, I will say, actually I didn't know how to tell her about that one. So when I told her, I was really crying. So yun ang fear ko, that she might get, mahawa ko siya because I was exposed, baka siya magkaroon ng sakit. And because she's also on a high risk. So at that time po, I went in my room po and I did pray. I prayed kay Lord, sabi ko, Lord, to spare her. Huwag sana siya magkasakit. Kung ako magkasakit, it's okay. I can handle it, I would say. But for her, it's doubly painful if you will know that binigay mo yung sakit sa kanya, na did you pass on. And that's one thing na sabi ko na parang hindi ko ata matatanggap. I did find out po that I'm not the only one po na na-expose po. So there were several of us na na-expose. The common thing po that when I talk to them po, the common thing po na sinasabi nila is that first is they're very grateful somebody reached out to them to talk. Because of course, kung sino man to sila rin, they have this feeling of guilt na hindi lang nila na-expose ang kanilang family, maybe they expose their co-workers too. And after that, they feel alone. They feel like depressed. There's a sting, something gano'n, because the fear of having exposed, having COVID, yung sting po doon is people might ostracize them. When I went back to work po, it was okay po that time. Sabi na, kung may pagbabago ba sa attitude ko or my character in taking care of my patients, taking of people of webs, no, there's none. Actually, it's better because I can understand now, because I experienced being on the other side of the spectrum. I experienced to be isolated. I experienced to be sick also. So andun na, I know how it feels.
Ito pong crisis po na kinakaharap po natin and during this time of pandemic, parang nagbigay po ito ng pagkakataon sa atin pong lahat na makita po natin kung ano po yung mas bagay na dapat nating pahalagahan, na hindi po yung kung ano po yung katayuan natin sa lipunan or kung ano po yung mga bagay na na-acquire na natin ang importante, kundi yung pong kung ano po yung maibibigay natin para pa rin po sa iba, yung maitutulong po natin, at parang kailangan lang po na magtiwala tayo, pagtibayin po natin yung pananampalataya natin sa Panginoon, dahil ito lang naman po talaga yung magtatawid sa atin sa lahat sa panahon na ito.
But I just want to share, pause, pray, take a rest, maybe exercise, and other things that will sometimes give peace to your soul, and then I can face the joy and the new day with a new battle again.
Yung mga galing sa Philippines and they wanted to come here, iba't iba ang reasons natin. Let our country be proud of us as a Filipino. We are hard workers. We can face anything, but just keep in mind that we have also our own. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget our kababayans. Don't forget who we are.
To my fellow nurses po, mga frontliners po, I know this is a scary time for all of us. The Lord had taught me po on something na another form of PPE, which is, sabi ko, a PPE stands for people, our loved ones. It could be the people that you're reaching out din po. Another people is prayer. And the last one po is Emmanuel, God is with us po. The PPE that we use in the hospital are just for physical, technically, to protect us physically, sa atin that we wear outside. But this PPE po, it helps us inside po. So we keep on fighting, we keep on moving forward po sa natin. So one thing po ma-share ko po sa inyo sa mga fellow nurses po is that one po. Of course, huwag po tayong panghihinaan ng loob. At times po na ganyan po, maraming changes, maraming challenges. We need to continue to move forward po sa ganun po.
Again po, maybe we can give another round of applause to our frontliners. Those were some beautiful stories and beautiful insights. I think perspectives maybe we didn't even know, because that's something that we don't experience. But even outside of the medical field, our people around the 12 million diaspora have been going through their own pain to pearl moments as well. And we wanted to segue into this next video. If you don't know what 12 million means, it comes from a book called A Sea in Miracle by Kishore Mabubani, where he states that there are 12 million Filipinos living outside of the Philippines. And chances are, if you're logged in this webinar right now, and if you look at the other screens, look at the other faces that are there within this Zoom, chances are we are all a part of the 12 million. So again, maybe we could say hello. Hello to the people that are online. Even beyond the medical field, with those beautiful stories, there are also many pain to pearl moments that our Filipino diaspora have shared, and we also had the privilege of interviewing them and asking them for their pain to pearl moments and their stories as well. So with that, we also want to share with you the 12 million pain to pearl moments and their stories.
Hello everyone, Tess Pascual, 49 years old po from Spain. I am a graduate of Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and worked with Philippine Airlines and Lufthansa back in Philippines. But when I arrived here in Barcelona, year 2006, I never imagined that I would be working for a family just to be a nanny. 14 years na po ang nakalipas. It was hard for me to accept then at first. Pero ang sabi ko, kakayanin ko basta buo lang ang pamilya. For 5 years now, aside from linis bahay sa umaga, travel agent ako sa gabi. Lahat ng klaseng trabaho pinasok ko just to survive.
Ako po si Jonas, I'm 23 years old. Nakatira po sa Barcelona, Spain. Magte-10 years na po ako dito. Siyempre, yung una, hinahanap po yung buhay sa Pilipinas. Kasi nung una, naboboring po ako dito. Kasi iba po yung buhay sa Pilipinas. Hanggang sa nakapag-aral na po ako dito, nag-adjust po ako sa mga language po, hanggang sa nakapagtapos po ako ng web developer. At ngayon po, nagtatrabaho na po ako sa company po.
Ako po si Raisa Klimakosa, 32 years old po. Nandito po ako ngayon sa south of France ng almost 10 years na po. Nagtatrabaho po ako sa isang pamilya po. French po sila and nag-aalaga po ako ng mga bata.
Ako si Gino, 30 years old. 8 years na po ako sa Dubai. Ang work ko po dito is 3D designer.
Ako si Florida Bato-Bato, 35 years old. 5 years na dito sa UAE. At isa akong accountant sa isang travel company.
When the pandemic came, the world stopped. Sobrang nabawasan ako ng trabaho. Pinahinto sa work ang husband ko. Maraming nawalan ng trabaho. Tinamaan ang pamilya ko. But there's one thing I hold on to, na kahit kailan hindi niya kami pababayaan. Na ni minsan, hindi niya kami pinagkulang.
Naalala ko lang po, may mga panahon po na alam niyo po yung pag sobrang pagod ka na sa trabaho at uuwi ka ng bahay at minsan po naiiyak ka na lang kasi minsan mapapatanong ka bakit ko ba ito ginagawa, bakit ba ako nagtsatsaga na nililinis ng bahay, ng ibang bahay. Siguro masakit siya kasi po naalala ko noong nag-aaral ako, ibinigay ko yung desk ko, ibinigay ko yung nag-aaral ka pong mabuti, pero siguro yung in-expect mo lang na gusto mo, hindi siya nangyari. Kaya po, siguro masakit yung minsan pag naiisip mo. Malayo sa pamilya, malayo po sa mga magulang, malayo. Siyempre, ako po, ngayon malayo po ako sa asawa ko po. 10 years na po kaming long distance relationship.
Nung una, hindi ko in-expect na ito mangyari, itong lockdown. Kasi nung before lockdown, sobrang dumadaan po yung pamilya ko na puro away na lang, yung hindi ko na alam kung anong gagawin. Tapos, hindi ko pala alam na itong lockdown ang makakatulong sa pamilya ko. Kasi, kinulong kami sa isang bahay lang na mas nakilala yung isa't isa, na mas naging close. Kasi nung before, parang laging walang tao lagi sa bahay namin. Pag mag-away yung isa, alis yung isa. Kaya ito parang wala, no choice kami ganun. Dumating po yung website, Virtual Church, na parang sinasabi sa akin na kung gusto ko bang sumunod. Kasi nung una, ayoko. Kasi lagi kong dahilan yung pamilya ko na wala akong oras, sobrang pagod ako. Pero hindi ko alam na yung binubuksan palang pinto, doon pala nila makikilala yung village. Nung una kasi na umatin lang sila sa mga event-event. Pero nung binuksan nila yung online, yung website, parang mas nakilala nila yung village. Pati mas nakilala nila si Lord sa panahon na yun.
Pagkatapos ng kontrata ko, nakahanap ako ng trabaho na wedding events. So, isa akong 3D designer doon. Akala ko okay na. Okay na yung sahod, okay na, hindi na siya ganun kahirap kasi hindi na expose sa chemical or sa ano. But it's another challenge din kasi yung amo ko medyo mahirap siyang pakisamahan. Nagtagal ng almost 1 year din, nagsara rin ulit kasi recession ng UAE or madaming opportunity na nagbukas sa akin nung pagkagaling ko doon sa stressful na year sa company na wedding. May mga tumawag sa akin, refer ng ganito, refer ng ganyan. Marami siyang nagbukas na pinto para sa mga trabaho. Napunta ako sa events, gawa referral sa isang amo ko. Di ko alam yung 2 years ko doon na binuno. It's it's a training ground sa akin for the next step ko sa career.
Then, pandemic happened. Una talagang naapektuhan yung travel industry. Kinausap kami ng March, may possibility na magtanggal. Actually, for the first time, nagbigay sila ng bonus ng January, nag-increase sila ng sahod ng January, then by February, sabi nila, babawasan yung sahod. So, first time na magbigay ng bonus and magdagdag ng sahod, then babawiin the next month. April, birthday ko yun actually. Tinawag kami ng boss ko. Pinatawag kami sa office. Then, ayun, sinabi na ite-terminate na yung iba. Yung iba, magiging 15% yung sahod. They have to send us to our home country. Kasi 15% sino magsusurvive sa 15% na sahod dito sa UAE. But kasama ako sa 15%. It's the best birthday gift yata. Yun pa, sa bahay, nalaman namin na hindi kami makapag-renew kasi yung may hawak ng bahay affected din ng pandemic. Then that time, nung nag-ayos ako ng gamit, actually sabog ako that time, hindi ko alam kung paano ako kasi masyado kong iniisip yung future na paano na ako, hindi na ako makapagpadala sa Pilipinas, ganyan. Nakita ko yung isang letter ni Coach Amber. Dati nung binigay niya yun, parang 2 years ago yata yun. Hindi siya nagre-resonate sa akin. Tapos, nakalagay sa letter, sabi ni Coach Amber, you have a village that loves you and support you. Then, nung kunento ko sa kanila, biglang dumami yung bahay ko. Ang daming nag-offer na pwede ka muna dito sa bahay. Pinoproblema ko yung lilipatan ko tapos kung may malilipatan ako tapos ngayon po problemahin ko kung kanino ako lilipat. Sobrang dami ng offer.
I came to realize that it's not yet too late for me to learn. That maybe this is the right time to pursue something that I could make use of my time. Entering a new chapter in my life, I decided to enroll and study. I am currently taking up international business development on entrepreneurship, business creation, and digital marketing. I know it won't be easy, and there will be obstacles, especially I am a working mother and a wife, but that should not hinder me from studying. I just need to stay focused and manage my time well.
Yung papa ko na kailangan namin puntahan sa ospital dahil sa hindi na nagpa-function gana yung kidney niya na kailangan namin itakbo. Parang yung time na yun na hindi ko alam kung ano magiging reaction ko. Kasi sobrang pagod na pagod ako sa trabaho, parang gusto ko lang magpahinga. Tapos ganun pa yung mangyayari. Hindi ko inaasahan na yun pala yung time na gusto niya akong kausapin. Parang tinignan ko lang yung taas. Kala ko nung una umuulan. Tapos sa pagtingin ko sa taas, biglang napaluha lang ako na tapos nilagay ko lang yung earphone ko na gusto ko lang na mag-relax. Tapos hindi ko alam na pag-play ko ng kanta, hindi ko alam na yung kantang bubungad sa akin, yung parang siya yung patnubay na huwag ka matakot sa mga bagyo ng buhay. Na nung nasa ospital na yung papa ko, hindi ko inaasahan yung pagtawag namin sa video call na kinakamusta namin, kung kamusta dyan. Hindi ko alam na sa 10 seconds namin siya nakausap na huli niya sinabi yung mag-pray lang tayo, nasabay-sabay lang tayo magdarasal. Kasi si Papa yung first time ko na sabi niya yung ganong bagay na mag-pray lang tayo. Kasi siya yung matigas ba na kumbaga kaya ko lahat. Kumbaga hindi niya inaasahan na yung pala yung sasapok sa kanya para lumapit lang sa kanya.
Unlike po doon sa, siguro marami po sa atin na wala pong work, syempre lockdown po tayo sa mga bahay po natin. Ako po ay kabaliktaran. Ako po ay na-lockdown sa work. Dahil nga po, stay in po yung aking trabaho, ay mas doble po or mas triple po yung workload po dahil wala pong trabaho yung mga employer ko at yung mga bata po ay wala po silang pasok. So, kaya po all day, all night, magkakasama po kami. Kahit po ganon, meron po mga opportunities po na naging pain po yun ay naging pearl sa palagay ko po dahil after lockdown po, unfortunately po yung amo ko po or yung employer ko po na lalaki ay nag-positive po. Yes po. At ang una ko pong reaksyon ay natakot po ako dahil nga po dahil sa mga narinig po nating balita. Pinausap lang po ako ni Lord na, di ba nurse ka? Yan. Kasi po sa Pilipinas po, bago po ako umalis, registered nurse po ako. Parang pinausap lang ako na bakit ka matatakot? I decided po na hindi po ako magpaalam at talagang asikasuhin ko lamang po yung buong pamilya po nila sa panahon na to dahil wala naman po talagang ibang tutulong po sa kanila kundi ako po. Yun nga po, ang ganda rin po dahil nagkaroon po ako ng pagkakataon na bigyan din po sila ng mga supplements at vitamins po at tuwan-tuwa naman po sila dahil naramdaman po nila yung pagmamahal po at yung concern ko po sa kanila.
So this pandemic, may challenge na naman kami. This year, operation ng cleft palate ng anak ko. So dapat na siyang isara before siya magsalita. Alam naman natin na maraming nangyari, nayanig ang buong mundo. Lalo na sa Dubai, nagbawas ng mga sahod, nagkaroon ng mga tanggalan. Isa ako sa mga nabawasan ng sahod ng 30%. At the same time, may surgery ng anak ko. So, wala talaga. So, alanganin siya actually. Hindi pa kami nawala ng lakas ng loob para ituloy yung surgery kasi we have a village and yung foundation namin is malakas. Na-survive namin yung surgery nung anak ko. Maraming tumulong, may mga nag-abot. So, hindi namin alam kung saan nanggagaling yung iba. So, bigla na lang dumarating dito sa bahay na may ganito, may ganyan. Then, na-survive, na-operahan siya, at na-operahan siya sa time ng pandemic.
Bilang isang Pinoy diaspora, huwag natin hayaan dumaan yung problema na wala tayong natututunan. Basta, kahit anumang pagsubok na dumating sa atin, pakinggan lang natin kung ano yung tinuturo sa atin ng panahon. Huwag tayong susuko, kumbaga diretso lang tayo sa buhay.
Sa mga may dinadaanan ngayon, especially during this pandemic, hindi ka nag-iisa. Tumingin ka lang sa paligid mo, maraming nagmamahal sa'yo. Take this very challenging season as an opportunity to grow and reinvent yourself.
Dahil sa isang sakit, buong mundo ay naging
All right. Maybe we can give another big round of applause, not only to our interviewees, but also the 12 million diaspora. Again, po, as we come to a close, I hope that this webinar and even just these last few elements have really encouraged us to really embrace the pain that we are going through right now. Because as we embrace this pain, it's not only helping ourselves. The way that we go through the pain that we're going through right now is not only going to help ourselves, but it's going to help so many people that will also go through the same stories that we are going through as well. So we want to encourage you, and we hope that you're leaving this webinar encouraged to embrace the pain and the moments that we have right now. And eventually po, they will become pearls as we embrace these moments po.
So this concludes our Pain to Pearl webinar. We thank you so much for joining us today. So can we have a little wave from everyone? Yeah. Okay, so just a few announcements. The first thing is please don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Anglahi Exploits.
And then the second announcement po is that if you want to stay connected with what is going on here and continue in this dialogue, continue on in these discussions as we move forward throughout this year and even move into the next year, we want to keep you connected as well with Anglahi Community Group. So our Zoom team right now is going to send a link for you to sign up in these Anglahi Community Groups. And our goal is that even after this event, that we would stay connected and that we would be meeting up twice a month to continually talk about what's going on with Anglahi, going on within the 12 million diaspora. And again, we want to use this to keep each and every one of us connected po. So with that, we hope that you can sign up, and we want to thank you again for joining us in today's webinar. Can we just maybe even give ourselves a round of applause? Woo! Thank you for taking the time today, po. We are so thankful for everyone joining from Europe, even Dubai, all over the world. We are global right now. We want to thank you po for joining us and taking the time to be with us today po. Salamat po.